Senators, when the House rose, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia was being debated. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, before I begin my contribution on the Sovereign Wealth Bill, I just wish to join with the Leader of Government Business and yourself in congratulating Sir Cyril Errol Charles on his elevation to the rank of Knight Commander. Congratulations to him. Obviously, myself and my colleague have particular fealty to His Excellency, having been appointed by him in his own deliberate judgment. Madam President, the utility of sovereign wealth funds, I think, has been fairly well established. As my colleague Senator pointed out, we are perhaps about 40 years in arrears in terms of joining in what has become almost a universal or global activity in terms of governments setting up sovereign wealth funds for various purposes, either general investment, development investment, or particular targeted interventions in their economies. The example, I believe, of the Norway Investment Fund, which is the largest single sovereign wealth fund in the world, is well taken. And the fact, I think, it was established back in 1960 something and has continued from strength to strength today, controlling over $1 trillion US dollars worth of assets. And so the potential of a sovereign wealth fund to meaningfully impact on the development of an economy and a people is well established and well stated. And I don't think is really up for much debate. The fact that this fund is aimed at climate adaptation, as again my colleague Senator pointed out, given our particular vulnerability to climate change and the impact of major and minor climate events, means that the need for a sovereign wealth fund targeted at these sort of developments, again, is well taken and well established. The issues, Madam President, and I use the word in a very general sense, will arise not so much in the conception of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, but in its operation. And so I begin my statements, Madam President, with a lament that I think, raised on more than one occasion, that it would have been useful, even in a draft form, for the regulations that attend this bill to be made available to us. Because a lot of the actual operation of the fund and how it will run and operate in practice will be governed by the regulations. The Act sets out, or the bill sets out, the very general framework for the operation and administration of the fund and the operation of the board. But the nitty-gritty, the details, are actually captured in the regulations. And so it would assist us in assessing whether, in fact, this Act is sufficient if we would be able to see those regulations and perhaps see where the loopholes and the gaps may exist. To turn to the Act itself, Madam President, I wish to start from Section 4, which spells out the purpose of the fund. And I note, again, that much has been made that the purpose of the fund is to support investment in climate adaptation and to assist in resilience in the face of climate change and climate events. And so therefore, the first two purposes of the bill are: one, to increase savings to build national resilience in accordance with the climate change adaptation policy. And I wish to pause again to recognize that this bill does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of a concerted effort, I believe, by the government to identify climate change, the weaknesses, created by climate change, and to address those vulnerabilities. And so reference is made to the Climate Change Act, which I believe we passed last year. And this is part of the operationalization of that act and its benefits. Two, to fund social and economic development in accordance again with the climate change adaptation policy, which is established under that Climate Change Act. My first sort of raised eyebrow then comes with Part C, which says then to support the development objectives of the government, including the long-term economic and social development of St. Lucia. And the question, obviously, which is begged by this section is whether this is sort of a catch-all, which allows the government, or the board, in fact, I should say, sorry, to facilitate investments that don't necessarily fall within the umbrella or the category of climate change adaptation. And obviously, then the question arises, why not have a separate fund to do that? Or if this is the case, let's deal with it in the total, in the round, rather than pushing climate change as the supposed purpose of this bill, but then inserting a catch-all generalized function at the end. And again, as I said, having the regulations might give us a better understanding of how this section is supposed to apply. Moving on to section 6, which deals with the composition of the board. Now, the governance of the fund is going to be essential. And whether the fund succeeds in its purposes and benefits us to the extent that we wish to will be largely determined by the effectiveness of the governance. The composition of the board includes a corporate secretary. And I heard in another place that there was a deliberate decision made not to appoint a CEO, but rather to appoint a corporate secretary who would oversee, I guess, the functions of a corporate secretary in a traditional sense, as well as the role of a CEO. And I'm hoping that the leader of government business can perhaps give us an explanation for why that decision was taken. Because there's normally a reason why those roles are separated, because it enhances governance. You have a CEO who is responsible for the management of the organization, and you have a corporate secretary who is normally in charge of the governance, and to some extent will oversee some of what the CEO is doing and make sure the records are accurately kept and reported. The functions of the board. Again, and I may have misheard, so I'm going to ask the leader of government business again just to clarify these things. In another place, a lot was said and made of the fact that there would be certain qualified public servants who would be serving on the board. Whether that is the case is not spelled out in here, but I do notice under Section 8, which speaks to disqualification, that public officers are disqualified. So I just want to get some clarification with regard to that as to who would be serving on the board, and to support what my colleague Senator stated, that if, again, the object of this fund is climate adaptation and assisting us in combating the ills of climate change, it would be good to have persons who are learned in the areas of climate adaptation to sit on the board. And I would also like to encourage, although I notice it says holds a degree in economics, that we perhaps put some emphasis on development economics, so that persons who are serving on the board have the understanding and the ability to assess the investments that are being taken in terms of how it will impact on the development of St. Lucia as a whole. And particularly in light of, again, Section 4.2c, which speaks to supporting the development objectives of the government and the long-term economic and social development of St. Lucia. I think it would be essential to have persons who have that development economics background to serve on the board. I have no comments per se in terms of having a custodian and investment manager. These are typical arrangements and structures for these sorts of funds, and I'm assuming that, again, in appointing both of these persons, the custodian and the investment manager, best practice will be observed, and those persons that are being appointed will be of international repute and ability. I note again, Madam President, that there are several reports that are to be compiled and are to be brought before Parliament. There's to be an audit of the operations of the board. There's to be an audit of the operations of the fund. And all of these are to be put before Parliament. But an observation that I have made in relation not just to this bill, but to a lot of the bills that we have, or acts that we have passed, that demand action from various entities and the submitting of documents and reports to Parliament, is that there's no sanction for the failure or the delay in complying with these orders, these sections and these requirements. And whereas I understand that the general concept is that there's obviously a political price to pay where these provisions are not obeyed in the strictest sense, if the concern that we have is to ensure that the sovereign wealth fund is being managed to the best of its ability, or the ability of the persons who've been appointed to manage it, we can only make those assessments if we have real-time information. And I just wish to draw to the attention of Madam President and the members the experience of Malaysia. I'm sure all of us who've looked into sovereign wealth funds would have come across 1MDB, which was or is the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, from which approximately $4.5 billion was embezzled by the sitting Prime Minister, who happened to serve as chairman of the board, and various other functionaries throughout. And a large reason that they were able to get away with this was the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability. And whereas the act or the bill does put in rather robust requirements in terms of reporting and who is to report and when it's to be reported, there is no penalty for failure to meet those obligations. The only penalty that I noted was where there's a failure to comply with directions or requests from the auditors, then the functionaries of the board are liable to certain penalties. But there's no liability, and I use the word again in its wider sense, for the minister, for example, if he were to fail to bring the reports to Parliament within the required 6 months after the end of the financial year. And I think this is something we need to look at, not just for this bill, but for all our bills generally, where we are imposing obligations on persons and parliamentarians in particular to undertake certain activities within specified times, that unless they come to Parliament and explain why it is that they've not been able to comply, and perhaps seek the sanction of Parliament to extend the period, that there be some sort of sanction that is imposed on them. Other than that, I think we are just, as I'm sure some of the members on the opposite side are going to raise, there are lots of times where we have, in various pieces of legislation, imposed obligations on members of Parliament, and when those obligations are not kept, basically, as they say in local parlance, nothing for that. We are without the information, we are unable to make rational assessments of the performance of these entities, and particularly in a situation like this where I heard again the intended amount is about 8% of our GDP is going to be the sum that is going to form the basis of this fund. When we are talking about such large amounts of money which has been said is going to be our patronage, our legacy for our children and so forth, we need to make sure that the governance structures that have been put in place are operative and operate properly, and ensure that we get information in a timely fashion, and that the persons who are, again, put in positions of accountability are held to account if they fail to live up to our expectations. So with that, Madam President, as I said, I don't think there's any question as to the utility of this fund. To some extent, the proof is going to be in the pudding as to how this is actually operationalized and it comes into effect. But I would like to see some strengthening of the governance provisions to ensure that as much as possible, the persons who have given responsibilities for various activities under this Act can be held to account where they fail to do so. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Harrow.
Good morning, Madam President. I hope that all members can hear me. I may be 25, but my back is in its 60s, so I hope I don't have to bend down for this too long. Madam President, under this bill, the Minister of Finance has the sole authority to appoint the board that will manage billions of dollars. The minister chooses the chairperson, the deputy chairperson, and approve key decisions. That's in clauses 6, 7, and 31. Madam President, where is the independence and where is the accountability? And while the bill mentions financial reports, there is no independent oversight body to ensure that these funds are not misused. Madam President, how can the people of St. Lucia trust that their wealth will not fall into the hands of political allies and special interests? Madam President, the bill claims to support climate adaptation and economic development, but it does not outline how these investments will directly help the people of St. Lucia. It does not promise to invest in education for young people. It does not commit to funding job creation for our struggling youth. It does not guarantee that resources will go into healthcare, small businesses, or community development. Instead, it speaks vaguely of investment and portfolios. But investment in what? If these investments fail, who suffers? The government? No. It is the people of St. Lucia who will suffer. It is our youth who will suffer mainly, Madam President. Now, this bill also presents some threats. This bill opens the door to reckless financial decisions that could cripple our economy. Clauses 44 allows for privatization proceeds to be used for the fund. What does this mean? It means that government could sell off national assets, the very resources of the people, to finance a fund that they alone control. And if this investment fails, if the fund is drained, Madam President, where do we turn? Are we borrowing more debt, and higher taxes? St. Lucians are already struggling, Madam President. Fund is drained. Where do we turn? The cost of living in this country is already high. Businesses are closing, and families are finding it harder to put food on the table, Madam President. Can we afford the risk of financial mismanagement? So this is what must be done, Madam President. Independent oversight. The fund must be managed by an independent board free from direct political control. Guaranteed investment in the people. A percentage of the fund must be allocated to youth development, education, healthcare, and job creation. Transparency and public accountability. The financial records of the fund must be publicly accessible, and decisions must be subject to parliamentary approval. Madam President, we are already in the spotlight around the world. Security is essential for the sake of St. Lucian citizens. So if we already have an economic fund, which in 2022 the government modified the economic fund legislation to allow the same types of investment as the sovereign wealth fund, then why create an entirely new body instead of utilizing and strengthening the existing fund, Madam President? There are bigger things that we need to be discussing right now in terms of security, in terms of economic prosperity for our nation, Madam President. Yes, climate change is important, and I agree with that 100%. It is important, especially as a small island developing state. But at the same time, economic prosperity for our young people, educational opportunities, and so many things need to be invested to have a prosperous nation, to have the funds so that we can combat climate change, Madam President. So these are my perspectives, Madam President. I hope that the leader of government business has been listening and taking some notes to go and make some amendments to this. But these are my statements, Madam President. Thank you.
Senator Fede.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the idea of a sovereign wealth fund sounds like an amazing idea. The implementation and the practicality of such, given our own inherent challenges, is something altogether different. Madam President, conversations about a sovereign wealth fund dates back to the year 2017 in St. Lucia, when the then administration would have met with the World Bank, ECLAC, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, to contemplate the vulnerability of small island developing states in the Caribbean. Madam President, it was suggested then that the need for a buffer fund, a need for a fund that can respond adequately and rapidly to overcome the bureaucratic hurdles that countries that are reeling against the effects of climate change, mainly natural disasters in this zone, how they can respond in the short term in terms of recovery. That fund, Madam Speaker, was seen as very important because it was at a time when we've had, Madam President, sorry. It was a time when we had several hurricanes around the Caribbean. We noticed what has happened in the Bahamas, what has happened to Dominica, etc., etc. Madam President, at every given time what we have seen is that the cost of recovery was more than the GDP of those countries. Now, it doesn't matter that these countries are small, vulnerable island states with very little capacity. These countries, Madam President, to compound their vulnerability, their debt to GDP consigns them to middle income status. And so if we look at what happens in the management of aid flows into countries with poorer balance sheets than St. Lucia, Barbados, BVI, which is a very, very, very high debt to, a very high income per capita country. These countries, Madam President, are exiled. They are not prioritized in the world development agenda of aid flows. And so that's another challenge. Madam President, it was suggested then by the IMF that the only way for the Caribbean to get out of this was to establish buffer funds ranging from 4 to 8% of GDP. In St. Lucia's case, that would amount to 125 to 250 million US dollars that we would need to have in cash that is there, sitting there to respond to disasters and other traumatic events that may be caused by climate change. Madam President, it must be noted, and my colleague stated, that a National Economic Fund did exist. And upon assuming office, Madam President, the National Economic Fund would have had in place $100 million that this administration would have been able to profit from. The governance of the National Economic Fund is very crucial because, Madam President, the way it was set up was so that the board made the final decision. And so in the act, Madam President, in the composition of the board of the National Economic Fund, you had the Director of Finance, you had the Budget Director, you had the Chief Economist, you had a whole range of very crucial civil servants drawn from relevant government departments. And these individuals, Madam President, or the board members, were the ones who made the final decision about where the monies of the National Economic Fund was going to be invested. The government, Madam President, or the cabinet of ministers or other statutory corporations within government had the opportunity to apply to the fund to say, well, we would like to invest in X or Y capital project. That was very, very clear. But the final decision was not made by the cabinet of ministers when the fund was conceived and passed back in the year 2019 was the legislation. I was in the lower house at that time, Madam President, and I remember being part of the cabinet and putting this together because we felt we needed to improve the governance of our CIP funds. This is where the CIP money mostly went. Interestingly, one of the major revenue streams for this bill, or the proposed sovereign wealth fund, is the CIP fund. And I'm going to get to that a bit later. But we're dealing with the governance for now and how that was conceived by the previous administration, of which I had the pleasure to be a part of. Come and fast forward to 2021. I remember, Madam President, it was on the eve of Christmas, and I came here and I was silenced because I said that the Labour Party administration was coming to Parliament to amend the legislation of the National Economic Fund so that they can do a step program for Christmas. I remember saying that, and I was shut up. I was asked, I can't say that, withdraw the statement, but I know what I was saying. Now, so the National Economic Fund, an amendment by the new Labour Party regime, was brought to the Senate. Came through the lower house, and we came and we debated it here. And that was back in 2021, just before Christmas. And in fact, the bill was passed in the House of Assembly on the 16th of November 2021. And they amended the bill, and they said that Cabinet, not the board anymore, not the Director of Director of Finance, not the Chief Economist, not the civil servants and the experts that we had put to manage this fund, but the Cabinet, the politicians. And so we can't remove the political dimension. And so fundamentally, the National Economic Fund Board was adjusted. Now, why is that important? Because we must, when people tell you what they are going to do, you must look at how they've behaved in the past. And this is how the St. Lucia Labour Party administration has actually behaved. They have done everything that is possible to make sure that they have a political advantage always. And so this is my opinion expressed by coming to amend the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. And we did so here in the Senate as well. In fact, it was passed in the Senate, Madam President, on the 18th of November, 2021. Now, the Cabinet. Now, fundamentally, the United Workers' Party administration felt that the National Economic Fund, the CIP monies, which were new revenues that were coming into the country, that the various governments ought to be disciplined. That's the word. And if any sovereign wealth fund is going to work, there must be fiscal discipline. Now, if you can't resist the temptation to make sure that you don't politicize the CIP monies, how can I trust you to make sure that you have the discipline to hold strong and stay committed to any climate change fund that you want to set up? That's the first question. Absolutely no discipline. Madam President, interestingly, I was just reading St. Lucia's Article 4 report from the IMF, which was published on March 2025. Makes very, very good reading. It says, Madam President, that debt levels have risen in this country higher than pandemic levels. No disaster, no pandemic, no economic catastrophe, but we see the debt at 75% of GDP is going out of control by the Labour Party administration. Now, Madam President, it was the independent senator who said that one of the most successful sovereign wealth funds and one of the largest is Norway. And I concur with that. But what we have seen, Madam President, and the IMF has written extensively on sovereign wealth funds. And the trend is usually oil-rich nations. We're talking about the Kuwaiti fund, very, very popular fund, sovereign wealth fund. So either oil-rich resource countries like Trinidad, they have a sovereign wealth fund as well. Or, Madam President, countries that have a current account surplus, meaning that their exports are greater than their imports. Those are the countries, Madam President, that have had very successful sovereign wealth funds. It means, and the norm has been, that they have racked up so much excess cash. They have done the work, they have grown their economies, they are now net exporters, or they have a lot of money from oil or from other minerals. That's been the norm. Those countries, Madam President, also have this in common. They have budget surpluses, not primary surpluses, because we come in this house and we boast about primary surpluses. Again, that's a political gimmick. But you have an overall deficit. In fact, Madam President, if I consult the summary of the estimates for 2024-2025, we will see that the overall deficit for St. Lucia in the current financial year is $214 million, $978,349. So government, just to operate itself, is actually short $214 million. The year before that, it was $111 million. The year before that, Madam President, it was $110 million. So we see, and if we look at the Economic and Social Review, we will see that governments after governments, we have been doing the same thing. And it's on the fiscal summary in the table of the Economic and Social Review. You will see that going back 30 years, the last Minister of Finance that had an overall surplus was John Compton. That's how far back. That's how much that government have been juggling, as they say in local parlance. Because, Madam President, the reality is government borrow to pay salaries. Government borrow to service debt. Government is just rolling over debt, Madam President. And in St. Lucia's case, St. Lucia dominates the regional securities market exchange, where we have the highest concentration in the Eastern Caribbean of market-driven debt. And so, while Dominica, with a higher debt to GDP ratio of 100%, we're at 75. Dominica gets a rap from the IMF, or an analysis from the IMF, that their debt, even though it's higher in GDP percentage, but because it's long-term concessionary financing, that they have been able to tap, more so than St. Lucia, and a higher concentration of long-term debt. Dominica's analysis from the IMF is that its debt situation is more sustainable than St. Lucia. Fact. So, Madam President, we are at a significant disadvantage to make a sovereign wealth fund work. It requires discipline. It requires a new style of fiscally running this country. Madam President, look, I am proud of what we've been able to do. The administration of which I'm part of, Madam President, and the members there, they like to go on, oh, look at all the money they borrow. Look at the debt that went up but they will never tell the public that we were dealing with one of the worst economic catastrophes. And even though we were dealing with the pandemic, which really cause the whole world to borrow, send a shock into the revenues of every country, and widen deficits around the world, we were able, Madam President, to put away $100 million in the event that something went wrong. I remember the leader of the opposition then, the member for Castries East in the lower house. And when we were debating that St. Lucia needed to have a wet day fund because of the vulnerability and because of the proclivity to have more frequent hurricanes at higher velocity. Madam President, many years ago, the CDB did a study, and it showed that a third of the CARICOM countries' debt was because they needed to respond to natural disasters. That's how big it is. And I'm sure that that figure is a lot bigger right now because of the higher velocity of hurricanes, and as well as, Madam President, the frequency with which the hurricanes are coming because of climate change. And so, Madam President, budget deficits is a big disadvantage, is a big challenge for anyone trying to set up a sovereign wealth fund. Madam President, we can't even put Panadols in the hospital. I didn't say that. This letter from the St. Lucia Medical and Dental Association said that our healthcare system is in need of much needed funds. The Minister of Health says that just Owen King EU Hospital alone needs $48 million to cover the bill that they have outstanding to various suppliers. These are the challenges that we face. And I want to share with the House just one line, a couple lines from this letter. And the letter is dated July 31st, 2024, so that's quite current. And the letter is from Dr. Merle Clark, the president of the St. Lucia Medical and Dental Association. And I'm happy, Madam President, to make this a document of the House. And it says, I write on behalf of the physician body of the Owen King European Union Hospital to express our utter dismay, disgust with the current state of affairs at the island's main hospital and by extension our healthcare system. The problems are truly too numerous to quantify, but we will attempt to highlight the most salient points coming out of a meeting of the consultant body. It is to be noted that these issues are not new, and you have been made aware of them, but the situation has been allowed to deteriorate to such an extent that it is simply untenable at this point. That's the state of our main hospital. So, the point is, Madam President, quite starkly, and the physicians of the country have shown us, in fact, it goes on to say that this is an all-time low that the Owen King EU Hospital has been in terms of the supplies and so on that it has received from the government. Now, it tells us, Madam President, that we are juggling. We're borrowing. We have current account deficits that are over $1 billion. Our imports are lower than our exports by over $1 billion. And it's been running. The Economic and Social Review is clear. It's there in the pages. Our budget deficits are wide. So don't come and tell me about primary surpluses and Philip J. Perez from the East and he's Moses. Oh, that's all of that is political gimmick. The numbers are quite clear that the country is in financial trouble. That's where we're at. We have overall deficits. St. Lucia is in a financially bad position. We have very little fiscal space. Oh my God, if I read the debt to GDP is 75%. Government is borrowing to service debt. Government is borrowing to pay salaries. Government is saddled, Madam Speaker, with a financial crunch gripping it. And we don't see any real sign that we're going to come out of this. Now, I want to say this. The only way St. Lucia can successfully implement, we might pass the law, Madam President, we might come here, sing Kumbaya, and pass the law. That's easy to do. We've seen many bills pass in this House, but the implementation is bad. And one of the reasons why we have primary surpluses in the book is because the government has fallen short of implementation on their capital side. Look at what they've budgeted and look at what the actuals are for capital. They are slow on implementation, and their record of implementing is very, very poor. So, Madam President, I don't really have much confidence that this administration can successfully implement a sovereign wealth fund. They're going to get the votes today. The ayes always have it in the Senate, of course. Everybody follows their party. It's a party thing. And the government is in power, so you have the votes. But when we leave here today, you have no choice not to recover the economy, not to boast about economic growth that came about because of lax COVID protocols. I mean, if you have a tourism economy, if tourism is one of the main drivers of your economy, and tourism was disrupted because of the COVID protocols, you can't take credit for the world normalizing itself for COVID protocols. I've heard analysis in both levels of the House, Madam President, saying that every year St. Lucia has grown by more than 3%. That's absolutely ridiculous. Madam President, if you are in a hole and you come higher to ground level, but you're still in the hole, you're still in a hole. So where is the aggregate economy from 2019? What was the financial value of economic output from 2019, and where are you now vis-a-vis 2019 is the real question. But when you use numbers are recovering because the COVID protocols are laxed and hotels are reopened, there's nothing genius about that. We need to stop that. If you want the sovereign wealth fund to work, there must be intellectual honesty. You must be reasoning with the people. Your analysis must be sound. You can't play this political gimmickry to tell people that, oh, the economy is booming and unemployment is the lowest it has ever been, when the same statisticians tell you that 2023 or 2022, that the analysis in counting unemployment has changed. The methodology has changed. So you can't be boasting that unemployment is the lowest it has ever been. That is not true. There's a new base year which was established in 2023. And the Economic and Social Review, the Central Stats Department, told us so. Now, Madam President, the National Economic Fund bill is to be financed through the CIP. Yeah? It says funds are coming. The same legislation. You see, I don't know why I bother to debate with the leader of government business. He's never aware of the bills he brings to the parliament. The National Economic Fund bill, which you have brought today, proposes, sorry, your sovereign wealth fund. I'm confusing you, sorry. The sovereign wealth fund bill, which you have brought here today, proposes that a financial stream will be the National Economic Fund. Okay, we're on the same page now? Oh, you didn't write that? You want me to show you where it is? The National Economic Fund will be financed. One of the financial streams is the CIP. Madam President, given what this administration has done to the CIP, I can tell you that that corroborates the point that I have been making, that a sovereign wealth fund in its construction faces significant headwinds. Now, you've got the United States, a big New York Times article suggesting that St. Lucia is on a list of countries, 43 countries in the world, cited for national security concerns. And one of the reasons is because of the CIP situation. So there are 4 countries in the Caribbean, there are 5 CIP countries, but we are 4 out of the 5.
Senator Gideon Ferdinand.
Madam President, I rise on a point of order.
What is your point of order, Senator?
Senator Fede has just misled the House, and I wish to correct this. He has just stated that St. Lucia is on a list of countries because of CIP and whatever else he just attempted to say. I wish to, first of all, say that this is not the case, and this is grossly misleading and untrue. In fact, only this morning, the U.S. State Department made a statement in the person of Tammy Bruce to categorically state that there is no list. That list does not exist, and whatever propaganda is out there, there is no list. And I want to make it clear in the Senate that Senator Fede has just attempted to mislead the House, and that this statement is untrue and should not be allowed.
Senator Fede.
So, Madam President, I'm in a good mood today. I will say to the leader of government business, I'll be kind, and I'll move away from that line of argument. But I'll say this, that...
Madam President, if I was not clear...
Yes, Senator Ferdinand, I get you. Senator Fede, I was hoping you would respond to Senator Ferdinand's utterance, that he said, your utterance that St. Lucia is on a list from the U.S., etc., that this is not true. I'm hoping that you would respond, because no such list exists. This is what he has indicated to us.
Yeah.
So
the gentleman, the
Senator Fede.
Yes, ma'am.
They are senators.
Thank you.
This is Senator Ferdinand.
So, Madam President, I am quoting a reputable media house just like him. He read it in the press, and I read it in the press. Okay? So, I read in the New York Times, one of the most credible publications in the world, and he's free to quote whichever publication that he read it from, that there is a list of 43 countries. St. Lucia is among 4 of 4 Caribbean countries that are on a list that are cited by the U.S. State Department for national security concerns. If he has read his publication, then it's publication versus publication. But all of us are quoting. I don't know which publication he has read it from.
Senator Ferdinand.
Madam President, I wish to repeat. Senator Fede has made a very damning statement and says that he has information from New York Times or whatever source. I have just indicated that this morning, current information, today, the U.S. State Department made a public statement directly through its spokesperson, Ms. Tammy Bruce, to indicate, to clear that misconception that there was a list, and has indicated categorically that there is no such list. And if Senator Fede continues to incite or to suggest that, I would suggest, Madam President, that he should withdraw such a statement and should not be permitted to continue to say that there is a list when it has been cleared by the U.S. State Department as early or as recent as this morning.
Senator Fede.
Me? Madam President, I would really love to see the statement that the minister is talking about. If he can make that a document of the House, then I can take his word for it. But right now, Madam President, I have no proof that what he's saying is the truth. And so therefore, to ask me to redraw a statement based on his word is absolutely ridiculous.
Senators, I shall make the decision that both of you senators shall present to me the statements within which I shall make a decision. If it is presented that the State Department has made that determination, has brought out that information, you will have to withdraw your statement, Senator Fede. I advise you to move away from that statement until such time that information is brought to my desk, so you move on with your debate away from this statement from the New York Times.
Very well, Madam President. Thank you very much. Yeah. So, Madam President, the CIP industry, by all professional commentary, faces significant headwinds. And whether the New York Times statement is true, or whether the State Department has said that there is no list, what we know for a fact is that in the European Union, that the Parliament of the EU has actually voted that the Commission or the Secretariat of the European Union can actually take an immediate decision on removing visa-free access to any country which presently enjoy it. And what it's also go on to say, Madam President, is that the CBI programs around the world, not just the Caribbean, because European CBI programs are also under pressure. And so, therefore, Madam President, with the increasing population of the various jurisdictions in the Caribbean, in the case of the Caribbean, Madam President, there has been an increase in the population of over 40,000 in the CBI countries collectively. In the case of St. Lucia, I have presented 2 contracts in this House, which shows that with contracts the government signed with one country alone, Galaxy, it would mean that just Galaxy passports alone would have added an additional 11,000 foreign citizens into St. Lucia. Now, Madam President, when you look at what's happening geopolitically, and you look at, for example, Iran as a country cited by Western countries as a financier of...
Senator Ferdinand.
Madam President, Senator Fede, thank you. I rise on a point of order. Again, Senator Fede has attempted to mislead this House. He has just stated that he has presented, documents or contracts to this House that some investor would have procured or would have purchased, or whichever word he used, 11,000 passports. Madam President, I have been in this House at every sitting that Senator Fede has been. That has never been done. I have never seen any such contract in this House. I have never heard of it. And Senator Fede is attempting to get away with making that statement, which is grossly untrue. So again, Madam President, I would like for Senator Fede to withdraw that last statement regarding presenting to this House contracts that suggest anything to do with any business or any investor having 11,000 passports to be sold. Madam President, that is dangerous and untrue.
Yeah.
Senator Fede, Senator Ferdinand has indicated your utterance that the two you have presented in the Senate, information regarding 2 contracts, where in total there may be about 11,000 passports or St. Lucian citizens, becoming St. Lucian citizens. Passports. I need you to respond.
So, Madam President, first of all, if the senator is going to quote me, he needs to quote me properly. That's number one. Number two, I have submitted to the House that Galaxy, now it's funny because the leader of government business, is within the portfolio as the junior minister under the CIP the CIP ministry. And if he does not know that Galaxy has been presented a contract to build a hotel in Canals.
This is not the discourse. This is not what Senator Ferdinand has an issue with.
But
he indicated that your utterance in the Senate about 11,000 passports via 2 different agencies or contracts is what he wants you to address.
So I'm addressing that now. Okay?
Get to the point, Senator.
So, Madam President, I'm the one on the floor, you know.
Senator.
Yes. But I'm addressing it right now.
You are going around in circles. He has indicated that you made a statement. I am speaking. Do you mind? The chair will be heard in silence. Take your seat, please, while I speak. The senator has indicated that the information that you submitted to the Senate is untrue about the 11,000 passports. I need you to address that only issue, Senator.
Madam President, the standing orders are quite clear. The government senators, it is incumbent on them to provide documents to substantiate their statements. The same level of obligation is not required of the opposition. I'll also submit to you, Madam President, I'll go further, that even though the standing orders does not require me to, as soon as I'm finished with my debate, I will present this House, I'll make it a document of the House, that Galaxy were 2 contracts were entered into with Galaxy, one for infrastructure, where they're allowed to sell up to 6,000 citizenship applications, and 2, one to build a hotel in Canals, 5,000 citizenship applications. So if the leader of government business has proof that that's wrong, present the Honorable House with the proof.
Senator Ferdinand.
Madam President, I rise on a point of order, which is the same that I rose on before. The member has misled the House and is now attempting to change the conversation. Madam President, when I stood, I did indicate, and I quoted the member. He said that he has brought to this House before 2 contracts that suggested that Galaxy, or whichever investor he mentioned, has had these 11,000 passports. He is now saying that this thing exists. He said that he has brought it to this chamber. My point of order was very simple. I said that this senator has never come to this House to bring in any document that says such. If he had, I would have had a copy. We would have known about it. Now, Madam President, I am not mixing the issues. My point of order is very clear. To say that you have come to this chamber at any time and submitted 2 documents or 2 contracts to suggest sale of passports is what I have contended is not true. That did not happen. If he wants now to change the argument, that's up to him. But that statement that 2 contracts were brought to this Senate by Senator Fede to suggest that this government had any sale of passports to Galaxy, Madam President, sa pathway. This is not true. And Senator Fede needs to withdraw that statement. That is all I have an issue with.
I am checking, and I think I have to check the record as to whether the senator actually said he has brought contracts to the House. I did not quite get that he said he had brought contracts, but I may have to check that. Senator Fede, is that what you actually said or meant to say?
Madam President?
I remember that before Christmas. I want to clarify that he said he has brought contracts to the Senate.
Madam President, I will make a copy of the contracts available. I have them virtually, okay? I will go downstairs as soon as I'm done. Please allow me to finish my presentation, and I will make it available to the Senator.
Okay.
But what the Senator, what he's not
Hold on. Did you actually say that you brought the contracts, a copy of the contracts to the Senate?
Madam President, we've had this back and forth before, and I WhatsApp it to the leader of government business. But if he's going to suggest that WhatsApp is not okay, I'm going to go and print all copies Yeah? And I'm going to make it so, but Madam President, he's not denying that the contracts exist. Remember, he's not denying that 11,000 passports, 11,000 citizenship applications have been sold to Galaxy overdue. What we're seeing now is that him saying, I have never brought it to the House.
Senator Ferdinand, we are getting caught up in different issues and concepts and topics. We're talking passports, we're talking applications, what exactly is the issue that we need to clarify? That applications, 11,000 applications or 11,000 passports? Senator Ferdinand.
Madam President, if that was the issue, I would have rose on a point of elucidation. I did not rise on a point of elucidation. I understand the standing orders very well. I am rising on a point of order. If I was not sure about whether it was passports, I would have risen on a point of elucidation so that the member could elucidate. But what he has said is just grossly incorrect and untrue. And he's attempting to change the argument and talk about what exists. Madam President, none of us here have any information on what he's talking about that exists, except his own allegation and statements. Madam President, I will repeat, there has been no time in the Senate that we, these members, or this member, has brought in contracts to suggest that St. Lucia has sold any number of passports to Galaxy. And by the way, Madam President, we do not sell passports.
That's right.
And even that statement is misleading, Madam President. All the member does is every time he's caught in one untruth, he moves to another. And I think it is incumbent upon us in this chamber not to allow any member to continue to weave around and mislead us. I think I made one statement that he didn't bring the documents here. He has now shifted to say the documents exist, and he's saying that we have sold passports to Galaxy, which is not true. So, Madam President, I really think we need to make this clear that the member should not try to mislead this chamber. And if I have to stand again, Madam President, as long as you give me permission, I will continue to stand and insist that this member must not say things in this House that are not true.
That's right.
Senator.
Thank you, Madam President. So, I may have to quote the first contract with BMAX and Galaxy, with Galaxy and the government of St. Lucia.
Senator Alison Shaw.
Thank you, Madam President. In accordance with Section 37, Madam President, I beg to question the relevance of this subject of Galaxy and passports to the bill that we have at hand, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia bill.
Thank you, Senator Shaw. I think I will allow Senator Fede, and I do acknowledge your standing on this point of order to ask this question, but in the fact of the matter with the standing order posed by Senator Ferdinand, I wish to have Senator Fede respond and to put this matter to rest. So I ask Senator Fede that Senator Ferdinand has indicated again your utterance, what you placed here on record is inaccurate, is untrue about Galaxy, the company, being given contracts for 11,000 passports, the sale of 11,000 passports. I am giving you the opportunity, Senator, to clear or withdraw what was untrue and indicate exactly what your statement is.
Thank you, Madam President, for your guidance, as always. Madam President.
By the way, I will give you the extra 5 minutes because there has been a back and forth and your time has elapsed. So I will allow you 5 minutes to wrap up.
Thank you for being so generous and kind, Madam President. Madam President, the first agreement is between the government of St. Lucia and Galaxy for infrastructure, and it was signed on the 12th of January 2024, Madam President. And in that agreement, the government suggests that the government requires of Galaxy to put up front $100 million US. And Galaxy will be refunded by selling under the infrastructure program to allow to sell 6,000 applications. An application, Madam President, could have more than one dependent, a family of 2 or 3 or 4. So that number, the minimum is 6,000 in terms of applications. But the number of passports which citizens are allowed under the program is that much more. Madam President, the agreement was signed between Yingjin, the director of Galaxy, and it was signed by Honorable Doctor to whom by the citizenship program is assigned. Okay, I will make this a document of the House. That's the first contract. The second contract, Madam President, so that's 6,000 minimum applications. The second contract is between the government of St. Lucia and Galaxy, signed, Madam President, in the 12th of January 2024 is when that was signed. And this is to build a hotel in Galaxy, in Canals, under construction right now. And Madam President, that contract suggests that Galaxy, because remember, there was an existing contract back in 2018, and the government has renegotiated this in 2024. And the new contract by the Labour Party administration says that the hotel will cost $400 million. The Prime Minister said in this House $1 billion EC dollars, $400 million US, and Galaxy will be refunded by being able to sell 5,000 applications. That is a minimum of 5,000 passports. 6,000 plus 5,000 is 11,000 in 2 contracts. I've made that clear. I've been consistent. The leader of government business, Madam President, he's really now taking this House for a joke. Because he knows that this exists.
Leader of government business.
Thank you, Madam President.
Games.
Senator.
Do I have permission?
Senator.
If he doesn't know.
Senator, I am speaking.
Madam President, the standing orders allow for members to make brief reference to documents, and I waited. I thought the member was just making a brief reference to a document. Now that he's quoting extensively from the document, none of us here has a document. He has not made it available to us. And knowing his tendency to have documents in his hand, reading from, and saying things that are not in the document, I do not trust him continuing to make extensive reference to any document that I cannot follow. And so, Madam President, you have given him leave, and I understand, to make brief comments, but if he's going to continue to quote extensively, I would need us to have the benefit of that document. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Ferdinand. Senator Fede, I would recommend for myself, I would need to have these documents to me. So these are 2 sets of documents you have to. Apart from the contracts, a statement from the New York Times, also this, I ask you for this information. Now, you have 1 minute to wrap up your presentation.
And so, Madam President, the CIP program is very relevant to our debate here today, because the section in the legislation, Madam President, has told us very clearly that investments or a revenue stream of the national, the Sovereign Wealth Fund is the National Economic Fund. The National Economic Fund is where the CIP goes. Now, it makes it, Madam President, very, very difficult for this to work. And again, to recap, budget deficits, current account, trade deficits, imports are higher than exports in the case of St. Lucia, high debt, and very narrow fiscal space. And, Madam President, resource starved. We don't have oil, we don't have minerals. All of these make it very difficult. We're going against what has worked in countries that have very, very successful. Madam President, I know you've been generous with the time, but I'm going to say Madam President, just allow me 1 minute.
No, your time has elapsed.
Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Senator KG Anatusha-Shalry.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I wish to take the floor to place on the record my support for the bill before us. And Madam President, my starting point for my support is the fact that, and like one of the senators before me said, I'm pretty sure many of us seated in here and many citizens in this country, since the conversation of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, have perhaps read or understudied extensively what a sovereign wealth fund is. And we need not forget in the realm of this debate, Madam President, to perhaps make reference to what a sovereign wealth fund is and why a sovereign wealth fund exists. And this is the reason why I am beginning my presentation here today on an understanding of what the sovereign wealth fund is. And in an understanding of a sovereign wealth fund, Madam President, one of the things that is very important to understand is that a sovereign wealth fund does not necessarily exist for the now. Madam President, I'm a young parent with 2 children, both under the age of 18 in this country. And so I have a vested interest, Madam President, in the future of this country. And so a sovereign wealth fund, in my understanding of what it is, and I do not purport to be an authority on the matter, Madam President, but from my understanding, and so an opportunity to share with the rest of St. Lucia, that a sovereign wealth fund is really for the purpose of building savings for the future generation, Madam President. And so if we look at the composition of sovereign wealth funds in some other countries, we see those that are set up specifically for pensions, for example, Madam President. But the point of the matter is that they are futuristic in nature, Madam President. And so I think the onus is on me to stand up here in quite what I consider a historical time in the life of this country, Madam President, to lend support to such an initiative, Madam President, that will in its operation ensure that my children, Madam President, the children of St. Lucia, Madam President, I'm pretty sure there are other senators sitting here who also have children, Madam President, to ensure that we put things in place to secure the future of our children, Madam President. Madam President, I sat here and I listened very carefully to the arguments on the other side of the House, Madam President. And I wish, as I continue my presentation, perhaps to address some of them. Madam, in one of the presentations, one of the senators alluded to the fact that there is very little independent oversight, or there will be very little independent oversight of the fund, as is stated in the proposed bill. But Madam President, again, I do not wish to attempt to assume that I am a guru in the areas of economics or auditing. But Madam President, Section 42 of the bill before us, Madam President, speaks to an audit function. It speaks to an audit function, Madam President. And as far as my perhaps meager knowledge of auditing and accounting says, that these types of auditing is normally undertaken by a body external to the body that is managing the fund. And so if that does not give some level of external oversight, then, Madam President, I don't know what else will. But I wish to clarify, in fact, and I always say that we have to use the opportunity that we have as senators entrusted with this responsibility to ensure that we pass on knowledge and information, and I'm assuming that when the standing orders were written in terms of the ability to clarify information and provide documentation, Madam President, is so that we take on the responsibility of teaching, of ensuring that we are honest in our deliberations, that it was placed there. So I wish to submit that, Madam President. Madam President, the other issue was in terms of the use of the fund. And if we refer to the purpose of the fund, Madam President, although that we have seen, if we look at other sovereign wealth funds, that there is, like I said initially, there are several wealth funds that were formed specifically for pension. There are some that are more general in nature. Madam President, the proposal before us is that this sovereign wealth fund is specifically to ensure that we have adaptation and mitigation measures as it relates to climate change. And Madam President, we cannot undersell the fact that we are a country that is prone to the effects of climate change. Madam President, we also cannot run away from the fact that we've heard the pledges from the bigger countries in terms of climate funds, climate funding, climate fund mitigation. And every cycle that our members, our ministers, our Caribbean leaders attend COPs, Madam President, the cry is the same, that the pledges are not coming through. And so what do? Do you throw your hands up in defeat, Madam President? Or do you now take proactive measures, as this government is doing, to begin to put things in place to ensure that you now can safeguard yourself against the effects of climate change, Madam President? And Madam President, of course, like the leader of opposition business indicated, a lot of the wealth funds, the sovereign wealth funds that have existed, they exist in countries that have natural resources such as oil and so on. For example, the famous one in Norway, Madam President. And they've decided, let us put these funds away, generated from our natural resources, for these purposes. But Madam President, I could not help but perceive the posture of the leader of opposition business, Madam President, that no pani will, no pani bauxite, no pani si, no pani sa, so boanuka se no pasa fair. Is that what we really leading our people to believe? That because we do not have the natural resources, we cannot attempt to put something in place? And whilst I sat there, Madam President, and again, because I am constantly...
Senator Fede?
Yeah. Madam President, I'm very sorry to interrupt the member's presentation, but she's misleading the House when she said that I say, because we don't have all of these minerals, that we shouldn't. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, and I said, that we are at a great disadvantage by not having those things. Big difference.
I think she just spoke of your posture. She didn't say you said it. She said just your posture. She said she looked at your posture and she posed the question, are we saying that because we do not have? She never said you said it, Senator, I am telling you. Please proceed, Senator Tusa.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it is this same leader of government business who stood on a platform and took a determination in terms of who needed to be whipped and who needed to be flogged. But the evidence before us this morning, Madam President, is that the wrong name was uttered. But I move on, Madam President.
That's right.
Madam President, thank you for the clarification, because indeed what I had said is that, and I also indicated that I perceived, and I think I have a right to my perception. So thank you, Madam President, for the clarification. Madam President, like I said, we may not have the natural resources, but we have to start to give ourselves that credit, Madam President, that we can do for ourselves. And Madam President, what I was saying is, whilst I sat there and I thought about it, Madam President, and I have often made this comment in this House that when it comes to issues and policies that help or assist persons who we consider to be poor or in middle income or low income, Madam President, I get sometimes emotional when I speak about these things, because I know what I grew up in and I see what still exists in some facets around me, Madam President. And so it brought me back to a household, Madam President, where you have a household that has very little income, and we went to school and we learned savings. We learned to put something aside. Me buy la poulet, put en la pli, Madam President. It doesn't matter qui pitié ou ça. Même c'est dégo dessous. Même c'est $7 ou ça mette à sous côté pour la pli vini, Madam President. Ou ni pour mettre à sous côté. Ou ni pour mettre à sous côté. But again, we understand where these sentiments are coming from, because in one time in our history, Madam President, the posture was spend, spend, spend. Public servants cannot do budget, give a company to do it, Madam President. Nobody here can look at our fields and determine what to do with it. give a foreigner to do it, Madam President. That was a sport posture. Buy, go low, Madam President. For sale, come and buy. But I urge people inside of here, I urge our citizens, Madam President, that we should take a cue from the government, Madam President, that whilst we are ably bodied, Madam President, that we have to learn to put something aside for rainy days, Madam President. And the government is leading by example, setting an example for the people of this country, Madam President. Madam President, the leader of government business indicated that, oh, y'all are jumping up about primary surplus. Leader of opposition business, sorry, Madam President, sorry, leader of government business, referring to the primary balance and the primary surplus and indicating that y'all are jumping up about it. Madam President, there is a reason why the primary balance, and in our case, a primary surplus, exists in the budget and the accounts of a country, Madam President. And again, I always try to use this opportunity as an opportunity to perhaps educate and to enlighten the people who are so inclined to listen to us. Madam President, in our understanding of what the primary balance represents in our accounts, Madam President, it indicates that a primary balance is a useful indicator of a government's ability to manage its finances sustainably. Madam President, let's regarder un primary balance en dedans account, Madam President. Et quand constantly si ça nous jawe, c'est un primary surplus. Ça means la ni pli qui nous bouise, Madam President. Et ça ka di nous c'est gouvernement ça là, Madam President. Pays cette ici, Madam President, ni habilité pour manager finances li en d'une manière qui sustainable, Madam President. So la ni assez pour aujourd'hui et la ni assez pour demain. That is what a primary balance is, Madam President. And so this government, Madam President, ably led by our Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Honorable Philip J. Pierre, has been able to prove, Madam President, that as a country, we have been able to manage our finances sustainably. And a primary positive balance, Madam President, like we have seen, suggests that the government is generating enough revenue to cover its core operations. That's what it says, Madam President. And so we should not allow the opposition to mislead the people of this country by trying to water down and belittle the fact that we have seen primary surpluses, Madam President. Ça pas bail papi show, Madam President. Ça pas bail rien, Madam President. Ça c'est un bail qui important. Et nous ni pour assurer qui Jean Saint-Lici Kopouane qui ça y est. Et pour yo pas quitter opposition, try faire yo catch laisser on l'autre bagaille, Madam President. And so a government now recognizing that we've been able to achieve primary surpluses, Madam President, over the last few budget periods, Madam President, says to itself, now that we can do that, and now that we are content that we can do it a few more years down the line, let's begin to put something aside for the future generation. Climate change is a real phenomenon. Let's put something aside for mitigation and adaptability of climate change, Madam President. And Madam President, as an individual who works within the fishing sector, Madam President, a subsector of the agricultural sector, Madam President, I understand all too well what the effects of climate change is to this country, Madam President, to food security in this country, Madam President. Because a few weeks ago when the tides were high, Madam President, the fishers could not haul their boats out at sea, Madam President. It means livelihoods were affected because of the effects of climate change. It means, Madam President, I operate a cooperative, one of 9 around the countries. Our sales were affected as well, Madam President, because the fishers were not going out. It means they were not buying gas, and they were not buying hooks, and they were not buying bits, Madam President. So we understand the ripple effect of climate change on our country, Madam President. And so, Madam President, again, this is the same government, Madam President, recognizing that we are in that primary surplus position, Madam President, have been able to do so much for this economy, Madam President. And I'm pretty sure we've heard it, and we've heard it so many times, Madam President. But this is the same government who just one payroll cycle ago, Madam President, paid back pay to civil servants, Madam President. because there is enough for us to be able to tell our public servants, the public servants that we understand have to be revered and respected in this place, Madam President. We said to them, this is being owed to you, here you go, Madam President. The same government, Madam President, who recognizing how sustainable the economy is, Madam President, said in December, Madam President, here is a $500 bonus, Madam President. Okay? So, Madam President, it is this government who also recognizes that it's not just about the now, but let us prepare for the future. Madam President, a lot was raised in terms of oversight, in terms of who's responsible for what, Madam President. And I agree with the independent Senator Lee, Madam President, when he indicated that we have to learn to hold our public servants accountable, our ministers, for example, Madam President, accountable for the publication, the issuance, the submission of reports, Madam President, in terms of its timeliness and so on. And there is no debate where that is concerned, Madam President, that we have a responsibility to ensure that if there is an obligation to lay it before the Parliament, Madam President, that we work towards ensuring that it's laid in a timely manner, because of course this will increase the ability of our citizens to see the accountability and transparency involved in the processes, Madam President. Madam President, it is my hope that as we roll out this initiative, Madam President, and of course there might be teething issues, there might be things that we may need to come and change, we may need to strengthen, we may need to modify as we go along, Madam President. But I think that St. Lucia is well placed and well on its way to ensure that we put this structure in place like many other countries have done before us, Madam President, to again secure a better future for our citizens, Madam President. Madam President, the Norway Government Pension Global Fund, and the independent Senator Lee, I think, mentioned it in his presentation, it now boasts a standing of over $1 billion US, Madam President. Over $1 billion US. And so we might feel that this is over $1 trillion US, Madam President. We might feel that this is perhaps a bit far out of our reach, but let's not forget that this fund was established in 1966 it was, and the first funds were deposited in it maybe about 1996 or about. So they have had years to build on it, Madam President, given again the fact that they have the natural resource of oil. So we will get there, incremental steps, Madam President. But one of the underpinning things, Madam President, when you look at sovereign wealth funds that exist, is that there is a high level of holistic governmental support, Madam President, for the sovereign wealth funds. A lot of those that have been successful is because, and even the Norway one, Madam President, the former Prime Minister indicates that there was broad government consensus in the establishment of the fund and in the oversight of the fund, Madam President. And so I think it would do us well as a small developing country, Madam President, having taken that bold step to ensure that as governments, as different parties, Madam President, that we come together for our country, Madam President, that we come together for our future generations, Madam President, to ensure that this fund is established, that it is well established, and that it is in its dispensation, Madam President, that it does what it is set out to do, Madam President. And so with that contribution, Madam President, I want to again indicate that I give my full support to the establishment of these funds, Madam President, and so my support to the bill before the House today, Madam President. Thank you.
Senator Jean.
Oh, okay. But I'll try to. That's fine. Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I rise in support of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia bill. And like my other colleagues have explained what the Sovereign Wealth Fund is. But Madam President, being a novice in that area, I did some research to ascertain really the difference between the sovereign wealth fund and a sinking fund or several other funds that are held by government. And what I noted was that a sinking fund is a fund set aside to potentially meet future obligations like large expenses, loan repayments, etc. And in the case of this particular sovereign wealth fund, at section, I already need the, at section 4, where it outlines the purpose of the fund. I hope that we are all reading from the same version, the final version, which was circulated, I think, on March 13th. But the purpose of the fund at section 4, it says, is to support investments in climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and sustainable economic development. And section 4.2 says, without limiting the generality of subsection 1, the purpose of the fund is to increase savings to build national resilience in accordance with the climate change adaptation policy, fund social and economic development in accordance with the climate change adaptation policy, and C, support the development objectives of the government, including the long-term economic and social development of St. Lucia. So, Madam President, when I looked at other sovereign wealth funds in accordance with the Santiago principles, like my colleagues have said before, they are set up for specific purposes. And in our case, in St. Lucia, this particular fund is going to be specific to climate change, economic development, economic and social development. Madam President, in the past we've heard about lockbox, escrow accounts, Panama accounts, and all kinds of other accounts. And I see that this sovereign wealth fund is completely different to all these accounts that we have heard of before. I was particularly intrigued when I heard President Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, indicate that the United States will be establishing a sovereign wealth fund. And I thought that St. Lucia, in this case, was even ahead of the United States. Madam President, I find this legislation to be quite futuristic, especially given its purpose, and opportune based on our historical experience, especially as it relates to climate change and climate change adaptation. Madam President, not too long ago in 2010, October 30th into October 31st, we experienced the devastation of Hurricane Thomas. And Madam President, that was, for me, I had first-hand experience being at the time the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Communications, Works, Transport and Public Utilities. It was not yet named the Ministry of Infrastructure. Madam President, I could tell you, just about 4 days after that hurricane struck, we had several multilateral agencies coming to our doors. And I spent days in meetings, but all of them were coming to offer loans. And there was this anxiety, this haste for us to produce estimates of the damage that was sustained by Hurricane Thomas. And I kept asking them to hold back, because on the first day, the engineer says it will cost 10 million to repair the damage. The second day, no PS, 15 million. The third day, PS, 20-something million. At that time, Madam President, some people went to assess the damage via helicopter and was calling and say, oh, we need a bridge from Canaries to Soufrière. We can no longer access Soufrière anymore. We need this and we need that. So it took us weeks and months before there was a comprehensive damage assessment, which showed that we needed in excess of $100 million to repair the damage sustained by Hurricane Thomas. Up to this day, as we speak, there is still damage from Hurricane Thomas. If you go along the West Coast Road that is being constructed now by Namalco, you would see that there are retaining structures that still need to be repaired. I'm sure we will remember what we used to call the balconies that existed round the island. And during that time, you would think that, yes, we had all of these landslides and collapse of retaining walls. They actually painted the balconies yellow. So you could have seen all of the balconies as we went around the island. What did we have to do? The government of St. Lucia had to borrow monies to repair damage. First of all, Madam President, we spent in excess of $19 million to clear up landslides. Just to clear, not to rebuild. It was to clear landslides we spent in excess of $19 million. There was damage to bridges, damage to retaining walls, damage to rivers, damage to houses. I mean, we suffered an extremely deadly blow. And so, Madam President, this event followed by the Christmas Eve trough and damage sustained by Hurricane Beryl and several others. We have seen our vulnerability to the adverse weather events that are coming our way almost every year. And so, Madam President, for a government to now make a decision to create a fund that will be built, and like Senator Kejiana Tuse said, it's not a fund to start today and start withdrawing tomorrow. It's a savings account for the future. And so we have to realize the necessity of such an instrument. And it is also a lesson, like Senator Tuse said, for all of us to engage in savings for these wet days. It is for us, some of us are able to pay insurance in the event that there is such a disaster so that we can rebuild our properties. In the case of St. Lucia, while they may have the CRIF facility, there is need for much more because CRIF does not give you back everything that is required. And in addition to that, there must be events of certain criteria in order for you to benefit from the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. So, Madam President, this fund is extremely important for our government, for our country, because we also must ensure that we build more resilient infrastructure. Climate adaptation means that you may have extremes. You may have extreme drought, and you may have extreme rainfall. You may have extreme winds. You may have extreme heat. So, That type of variability, Madam President, is difficult to plan for. And so a fund of that nature is extremely important to be able to respond to what is coming our way. Madam President, I find it curious that people who aspire to public office have this cynicism of the power or the authority of ministers of government, particularly the Minister of Finance, to say that the Minister of Finance wants to control and so on and is appointing the board and this and that. But these very same people aspire to come into public office and become ministers. I don't understand that. This is, kind of difficult for me to understand. Because, Madam President, laws are enacted not for a particular administration. And this thing of one administration enacts a law and another one repeals it and back and forth. Laws are supposed to be enacted in order to safeguard the interests of the country. So, this particular legislation, I see it as one, and I agree with Senator Lee, that it must be tight enough to withstand the vagaries of the changes in administration so that there is proper accountability. So, Madam President, when I look at the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I want to highlight the uniqueness that I see in that fund. First of all, I find, Madam President, that there are stringent conditions in Section 8 of the legislation, which speaks to the disqualifications of the board, for one being a member of the board. So at Section 8, it states, a person shall not be qualified to be appointed or hold office as a member if not just he or she, but or his or her spouse is a director of or is in the full-time employment of an entity in which the fund has made an investment. I find this quite unique, because usually it would say if he or she is connected with an institution, but it also includes his or her spouse. That I find quite unique, because it means that your partner can disqualify you no matter how qualified you are in the areas that are listed in the legislation. And it speaks about the holds a degree from an accredited university and so on. So you can have all your degree, you can have everything, but your spouse working at the institution where the fund is supposed to be invested, upala, who are disqualified. It also, at Section 13, indicates that there is staggered appointment. So, one person, it says 3 members appointed for 5 years, 3 members appointed for 4 years, and 3 members appointed for 3 years. So it means that the entire board does not leave at the same time. That allows for continuity of the members of the board. I like that section, Madam President. It also, at Section 16, speaks about the suspension of a member. And it says that the minister may suspend from office a member against whom criminal proceedings are instituted for an offense involving dishonesty. Madam President, l'année moun qui était ici, qui était en gouvernement avant, qui passe à qualifier en disant ça, you are suspended from the start. Pour dishonesty, yo. We have heard about it. So myself si se sa yo pa eme sovereign wealth fund la yo ni pou mene CIP ek mene tout kalte bay. But from what I'm seeing there, this law is very strict. Now the minister does not only suspend. At section 17, the minister can revoke one's appointment. And again, it states that the minister may, by written notice, revoke the appointment of a member of the board if the minister is satisfied that the member is disqualified from being a member of the board under section 8, is unable to perform the functions, commits an act of misconduct, and so on. So, there is disqualification based on certain things, including your spouse. There is suspension, and there is revocation. So there is very strict scrutiny of the members of that board. Section 31(2), Madam President, also speaks to the directions from the minister. And again, I'm looking at the uniqueness of that legislation, where it says that where section 31(2), it says a direction under subsection 1 must not be given to A, invest an amount from the fund in a particular asset, allocate assets to a particular business entity or a particular activity. So we cannot use the funds to give any of our friends. That fund does not have FFF in it. That fund does not have horse racing and different things in it. The fund is specific to climate change adaptation and social and economic development. So, Madam President, I see that also as being very clear, very pointed on the use of the fund. Madam President, at section 33, it lists the custodian. And the custodian, actually, it shows the functions of that custodian. Now, Zafe custodian, they seem to have something about the custodian. Because, Madam President, when I looked at a draft, which was dated 2017, custodian latte had name under draft la. There was already a name of a custodian in the 2017 draft. So there is already a selection of a custodian in the minds of the people before. But in this case, the custodian is going to be determined by the Cabinet of Ministers. So that is extremely clear, and it is aligned directly with the Santiago principles. The other element of uniqueness, and I find very sound and very strict, is at section 42 and 43, where customarily the accounts of the fund must be audited. But, Madam President, there is one line in section 43(4), which says, notwithstanding this section, the board shall submit to the minister a forensic audit every 3 years. So, in addition to your annual audits, a forensic audit is much deeper than a financial audit. The forensic audit goes into your governance structure, goes into your guidelines, your policies, your principles, every single thing. That is your PSI forensic audit. A lot of things have been revealed from forensic audits here in St. Lucia, from time immemorial. When a forensic audit is carried out, it is carried out, just like Senator Tousse said, by an independent body. So first of all, your annual audits are done by your auditors. But a forensic audit goes to a deeper level. And so, Madam President, I believe the reporting requirements show the high level of transparency that obtains in that fund. Madam President, I can well understand the cynicism of the opposition because of the way they manage the country's resources in the past. Like the income support loan that was given by the IMF during COVID-19. When the people of St. Lucia were suffering as a result of COVID, when hotel workers lost their jobs during COVID-19, when the people by the market could not sell their produce, when they were running after people all on their farms, the IMF reached out to countries around the world and offered income support. Instead, what did they do? Oh, the IMF said, bill, and keep the receipts. Say, Sayotedi, income support means by se moun la anti soulagement, pis yo ped la vi yo ped salaire yo ped travail yo. So help them during that time for them to survive. No. C'est là yo te vle bil chimè. Yo fè un chimè a Oliwa Gozilea, up to now chimè a la. I pou fini, pis kanal la leze, roundabout la dan kwe, kalte bay, bill, and keep the receipts. Income support went to a particular few. So I can well understand the cynicism of the opposition. Madam President, I am hearing talk of fiscal discipline. Madam President, I want to find out, was there fiscal discipline when $32 million was given to put plastic grass on our playing fields? Was there fiscal discipline? Today we want to come and talk about fiscal discipline, but mind you, Madam President, I can say for a government to enact a sovereign wealth fund and want to ensure that we build that fund is a government that knows how to prudently manage its resources. That government knows that there will be, Senator Toussé say primary surplus. Mais Senator Toussé, Madam President, et toutes ces senators ici, this is a government that knows that there will be more than a primary surplus. That there will be a growth trajectory never seen before with positive growth for the coming years. That is a future-focused government. That is a government, Madam President, the government knows that through prudent financial management, we will be able to achieve savings that we can direct towards that fund. Madam President, was there fiscal discipline when a structure was purchased by the government, sold for 1/3 of its cost, and then rented back to the very same government? That is fiscal discipline, Madam President. Dis-moi, Madam President, peut-être matin aller à l'école. Because what I am seeing as fiscal discipline, or what I thought was fiscal discipline during the 2016-2021 era, when I go back to my school books, it's telling me otherwise. You know, some things that I saw, which was supposed to be fiscal discipline, make me wonder if it's Saturdays and Sundays alone I went to school. Was there fiscal discipline when land was leased or purchased or sold at $1 an acre, displacing farmers, displacing an abattoir, displacing a garbage dump? Was that fiscal discipline, Madam President? Madam President, we came right here in
Madam
this
President?
Senate.
Senator Fede, you're on
Yeah, I
your
rise
feet.
on the point of
You're
order.
actually on your feet.
Yeah, sure.
Senator Fede,
Thank you, Madam President. I rise on the point of order.
What
The
is your
member
point
is
of order?
misleading the House when she says that lands were sold for $1 a square foot. That never happened. Lands were never sold for $1 a square foot by the administration of which I belong. That never happened.
Senator Jean,
So if
Senator Fede has indicated that your information is incorrect, that land was never sold. You used to respond.
Madam President, I
and
particularly said sold or leased
sold or leased.
at $1 an acre. I maintain sold or leased at $1 an acre.
Senator Jean?
Yes, Madam President.
Which one is it?
Sold or leased.
Madam President, I rise on the point of order.
The point of order, Senator?
Yeah. Again, the member is misleading the House. We've got the public watching on television. And if she has documents to suggest that lands were sold at $1 an acre, she needs to provide it. Otherwise, she needs to withdraw that part of her statement and she can keep the lease part. But to say that it was sold or leased, she has to decide which one is she really saying.
Senator Jean, for the record, I would prefer that you deal with the correct two.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And thanks for Leader of Opposition Business for the clarification that it was leased at 99 cents. They take out 1 cent on it. But displacing the farmers, displacing the abattoir, we withdraw that too. Displacing the garbage dump that the government had to transfer to another spot, thereby having truckers to go and truck garbage all the way up to Deglo.
Incinerators were purchased.
For 99 years. Tell me, the issue is fiscal discipline. Let's not go down and sold or lease. Fiscal discipline. Fiscal discipline, that is what we're talking about. Now, if you come to class
Senator
late and you
Fede.
did not hear the beginning of the class,
Again,
Senator Jean,
Madam President, the member is
Senator Fede.
the member is misleading the House by going to a few isolated cases of incentivizing investment. I mean, they come all the time and give away taxes. But what was the debt to GDP ratio in that year?
Senator.
That's what the fiscal indicators
Senator
are.
Fede.
But that's the fiscal indicator.
Senator Fede, please take your seat. Senator Jean, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I think we need a class on elucidation and point of and misleading. I think we need that class. Yeah. And then the teacher flogs. Yes. We flog. Madam President, fiscal discipline. When 25 million, we came into this chamber, Madam President, and we approved a guarantee by the government of St. Lucia to pay $25 million to people who came to do the transition from Victoria Hospital to OKEU Hospital, Madam President. When our health professionals were ostracized and it was felt that they could not do it. Fiscal discipline, you say? Fiscal discipline, you say? Madam President, when people were taken, a firm was taken to do our budget that civil servants could have done, paid millions of dollars. We talk about fiscal discipline, Madam President. Madam President, again on the dark COVID, when we had already gotten the AstraZeneca vaccine. We paid $7 million plus to buy vaccines that never reached St. Lucia, up to a day like today. Fiscal discipline, is that what we want? Is that the fiscal discipline that we're teaching our young people, Madam President? Is that the fiscal discipline? Mais nous voulons venir avec pen CIP, avec your black brush. CIP is the Satan of St. Lucia. Tout ça CIP fait, CIP pas bon. You have many come bombshell pour dire, manier CIP pas kabati net. They bring people every Wednesday. They had somebody talking about the CIP.
Senator Fede.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I raise on a point of order.
What is your point of order?
And my point of order is that the member is misleading the House by indicating that the United Workers' Party administration, of which I was a part of, was fiscally irresponsible. The numbers are quite clear in the Economic and Social Review. In the year, and I want to use the debt to GDP as the major indicator of how fiscally disciplined we were. So, Madam President, it's on page 129, table 36 of the Economic and Social Review. And before the COVID years, in the year 2016, the debt to GDP was 60.9.
Senator Fede,
it came down
where
to 58.
Where are you going with this?
No.
You indicated that.
Clear.
Listen to me. Listen to me. You indicated that the senator is misleading. You need to tell me exactly what she said to be
because
misleading.
She's saying through and through her presentation that we have been fiscally irresponsible. The numbers show otherwise.
Senator Fede.
We have been below.
Senator Fede, I will be heard in silence. Please exercise that.
Sure.
Take a seat. Let me explain.
Yeah.
Senator Jean identified, or rather listed, certain areas where she perceived or she's questioning whether these were fiscal prudence. That's what she was asking. But you are saying she's misleading. So if you want to put forward your case, you have to indicate one, or at least one or two of what she said, and show where she misled or she gave incorrect information. You are going into the GDP, a general issue to look and present a case for your former administration. This is not how it works. You indicate she spoke about the budget being planned by the public servants or non-public servants. She spoke about a number of things. Which one are you alluding to?
Madam President, it is incorrect for her to say that because the government did this, that they are fiscally irresponsible. Fiscal prudence is measured by indicators in your fiscal indicators, a major one being your debt to GDP ratio. So if Senator Jha would like to say that in the entire administration of that United Workers' Party government that we were way above the regional target of 60% set by the ECCB, then that's a factual point.
Senator Fede, this is a difference of opinion. You were saying this is how it's measured, and the senator has indicated what she was questioning as financial prudence or lack thereof. Okay? We can go back and forth till we blue in the face and it's not going to change anything. Okay? I said if the senator has indicated or listed any area that you feel she has misled this House, please indicate exactly that. Barring that, I'm sorry, Senator Jean will be allowed to continue.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the good thing about it is that St. Lucians are wise people, and St. Lucians know the difference between fiscal prudence and fiscal largesse. They know the difference between wastage they know corruption, and they know good fiscal management.
Senator, you also have 10 minutes to complete.
Thank you very much. I will be utilizing my 10 minutes, Madam President. It's enough. It's enough. It's enough. I will not say I don't want and then ask you all for more. Madam President, because it was brought up, I just want to reference some statistics from the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank on the debt to GDP ratio for St. Lucia. From 2016, Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. That is the bank that monitors our situation in St. Lucia and the rest of the ECCU. The Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. This is the debt to GDP ratio, total public sector debt to GDP, Madam President. In 2016, it was 59.80%, and we know what happened in 2016. A transition took place from the administration of Honorable Kenny Anthony to the administration of Honorable Alan Shasley. It happened on the 6th of June, 2016. In 2017, 58.97%. Yeah, it got on, but wait. Sometimes you don't fast forward the movie. Let the movie continue. In 2018, 60.0%. In 2019, 61.88%. In 2020, 97.14%. Say that's COVID. Say it's COVID. Okay. Put it on COVID. But that was the time we were told to build, and keep the receipts. 2020, I said 2020. 2021, we know that a transition took place again, 88.07. 2022, 73.38. That is in the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Now, I cannot be misleading.
The Senator fading.
Quoting from the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank.
So, Madam President, the numbers of there's quite a disparity between the social economic review put together by the Ministry of Finance and what the member is quoting from her laptop, claiming to be the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Now, the important point.
You stood up on a point of order, which is?
Yeah, the point of order, again, is that she's refused to quote what it is now. And
Senator, let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
The senator is making her presentation, and you will not determine what she has to quote.
Yeah,
no. I have said when I'm speaking, I should be heard in silence. It's in the standing orders. Take your seat. Thank you. The senator is making her presentation, and she's at liberty to quote whatever she feels is relevant to her presentation. If she is misleading in any way, misquoted in any way, you may stand on a point of order and say she's misleading, and you may even ask for the information that she's quoting from. Please proceed, Senator.
Madam President, in my 5 minutes left, since he stole 5, I will just go on to show this chamber, this Senate, the sound economic management that has been exhibited by this administration under the leadership of Honorable Philip J. Pierre.
Senator Fede.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam President. So the member is misleading the House by suggesting that now we went on and we read very healthy numbers from 2016 to 2019 in the debt to GDP, where it averaged about 60. Give and take 2% from the numbers we have.
Senator Fede,
Yes?
take your seat. Let me speak to you. As I indicated before, and I indicate again, Senator Jean is quoting from what she calls the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, and you are quoting from, which is quite possibly there will be differences. But to indicate that she's misleading and to read from what you are reading, it does not add up here. If you wish, what? I'm speaking? If you wish, Senator Jean, to make this a document of the House, thereby you can compare with what you have in your document, it is all good and well. But you cannot take time off from the senator's presentation to argue and say what she's reading is not correct. That is why I've asked both you and Senator Ferdinand to present to me both of your documents so I can compare. The same happens here. Senator Jean can make it a document of the House, and likewise yourself, if you feel she's misleading, can make it a document of the House. But I will not allow you to interrupt the senator's final few minutes to present a case from the Economic and Social Review where she's quoting from something else. That cannot happen, Senator. I'm sorry. I will have to allow Senator Jean to conclude her presentation, and then she can make her document that she was quoting from a document of the House, and likewise yourself.
Yeah.
Senator Fede.
But, Madam President, that was not the extent of my point. So I would like a few seconds to finish the point of order that I started on, if that's okay.
Senator Fede, you started the point of order prior.
Yes, but
I told you this is what will happen. You come back with the same point of
Madam
order,
President,
which
may
is
I have
quoting
10 seconds.
No, sit,
to
let me speak to you.
establish my point.
Sit, let me speak to you. It cannot be right that you are quoting from a separate document. We will be here till the cows come home. You have to indicate exactly what she said, which is misleading. And not the process, mind you, not the process, but exactly what Senator Jean has said that is misleading or an untruth. I'm waiting to hear.
Okay, Madam President, Senator Jean conveniently stopped at the year 2022 and failed to tell us that the debt to GDP in 2023 is 73%, which is higher than any year that is outside of COVID managed by Alan Chasney. And she stopped there because she wanted to leave a perception.
Senator, you cannot tell the senator why she stopped. We have to be, I think, sensible and wise in our utterances. So I please ask Senator Jean to please, I will allow you, Senator Jean, another 5 minutes to complete.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I just want to invite us to recognize sound economic management of a country and some of the indicators that we should use to measure sound economic management. Not money going to all over the place, and there's no accountability for it. And when we hear, you lucky you get a little bit of it. Let us look at the difference between wastage, largesse, having no regard for the taxes of our people and how that money is spent, versus monies that are treated with sound economic and financial management. Madam President, we have recorded, let's go back. We have recorded, Madam President, the lowest unemployment rate since 2021.
They don't trust the statisticians.
They don't trust anybody. They don't trust anybody. But if you don't trust yourself, you can't trust anybody. So, 8.8% unemployment over the period October to December. Si ou pa ni a job jodi a se ou ki pa vle. An official statement by the Statistics Department.
Senator Fede.
Yeah. So, Madam President, again, the member is misleading the House. In this very document, the Economic and Social Review for 2023, it stated clearly that the methodology is changed and you cannot go back to 2021. The methodology to measure unemployment changed in 2023, and therefore you cannot go back and compare 2021 with any year now, because the way
Senator,
we used to...
Senator, I'll have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Senator Jean is quoting her document. Senator Jean, please proceed.
Madam President, the truth is not what you want the truth to be. You know, the truth is the truth. And when the truth comes from credible sources, we have to accept the truth. The truth is not for the 43%ers. I said the Department of Statistics. Madam President, if Senator Dominic Fede would allow me to conclude my statements, Madam President, he will hear my sources. He never allowed me to get to 2023 figures for GDP. He stand up on a point of order and, you know, allow me to complete my statements, Madam President.
New York Times.
Madam President, the people of St. Lucia knows who misrepresenting and who not. They know. Go back and read their comments. Okay? And Madam President, you know we're reading debt to GDP ratio. But if you add all the acts of wastage that I outlined, if you added that back, you would have seen the impact it would have had on the debt to GDP ratios. That's what we need to go back and add. Toute la geste là, baite belle, everybody in nice car and everybody going out all over in the air. Thanks to COVID, COVID had to stop them. Madam President, our government that implemented the first ever minimum livable wage to the people of St. Lucia. That is what you call sound economic management. Madam President, a government who increased monthly pensions for government and NIC retirees. You wonder where there is fiscal prudence, fiscal discipline. Pensioners now, retirees, now know that they can go to the bank and at least they can get a minimum of $500 a day. And for those who work with government, $725, Madam President. Madam President, we have had 3 consecutive years of economic growth, and IMF projects a 3.7% for 2024. Madam President, a government that provides free ultrasound and blood tests for pregnant mothers and free health care for 80-plus adults. That is sound economic management of a country, Madam President.
My child to CXCs will pay them.
A government, Madam President, that has invested major capital investments in the health sector, provided $16 million to the OKEU hospital. Now they want to come and talk about doctors misdiagnosing. Doctors misdiagnosing a government.
Senator Jean, your time is running out. Please wind down.
There are 2 more minutes, Madam President.
Senator, I have ruled.
One last point, Madam President. Madam President, I just want to highlight the economic prosperity for the youth of St. Lucia through the Youth Economy Agency, that they have pumped over $3 million towards 664 grants into youth-led businesses and enterprises. So our young people like Senator Harrow has an opportunity today to open his business and thrive, my young man.
I'm standing on the
This is a government. And so, Madam President, I stand in support of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia. I give my full support to the government of St. Lucia on behalf of my people and my children. Thank you very much.
Senator Daniel.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I do hope that I will not suffer too much of the double dipping of people who make their presentations and have their time, and then under the cover of alleged points of order stand up and help themselves to additional presentations on the dime of other members, which really turn out to be points of argument and opinion and are not at all standing orders. But, Madam President, I know you've got this and you're handling it just well with the patience and forbearance for which I think you have become very well known. During the presentation on the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which I have taken my feet to support, I did hear the leader of opposition business, and I'm very careful to say leader of opposition business. Is so easy, to call you Madam Speaker or to refer to the leader of government business when you mean opposition, but confusion and conflation are two of the great liabilities that we have to contend with all the time. And there are certain confusions and conflations that I would not wish on my worst enemies, such as confusing one with the other, especially when they are both my very good friends. I did Senator Fede, the leader of opposition business, mention en passant about a wet days fund. Now, this is one time I will bear and I will brook an interruption if I'm wrong. Mention about we need to have a wet days fund, because research reports have shown that a lot of the economic impacts, negative economic impacts, and it's quite right, this has been published in many papers in the Caribbean, don't really have to do with any mismanagement by governments, but the effects of hurricanes, of storms that are getting worse all the time, even when you don't have the destructive high winds of a Hurricane Allen or anything like that. You have those that come with so much rain and flooding and landslides and the absolute destructiveness that. And I was wondering, well, why is Senator Fede questioning the Sovereign Wealth Fund and asking, expressing some questions about its being set up and the doubts about it? I didn't hear him say he's opposed to it, to be sure. But he had so many questions. I said, but isn't that exactly what the Sovereign Wealth Fund is supposed to be? A wet days fund? A fund to help us cope with the effects of climate change, disaster mitigation, and those sorts of things? So I'm just wondering, if we need that, then why are there expressed misgivings about it? The other thing which I heard more than once, and I'm not going to say necessarily in this chamber or another, I don't want to particularize them. There seems to be a continuous, and I'll use those words again, confusion and conflation of the Sovereign Wealth Fund with the National Economic Fund, which is a feature of our Citizenship by Investment program. They are not the same. They are two different things. And we cannot substitute one for the other. You cannot transform the National Economic Fund, which is a component of the CIP, with a Sovereign Wealth Fund. Your National Economic Fund, if you read the CIP Act, it says precisely what it is established for, what the funds in it are to be used for, and the very thinking behind a Sovereign Wealth Fund is just that it is sovereign. CIP depends upon applications for economic citizenship. And the National Economic Fund is one such track. I think initially the contribution to the National Economic Fund was pitched at $200,000. We do know when there was a change of government, this was cut by half to $100,000. We know in the act, and I don't need to go over it, what it is to be used for. Now, that is not to say that somewhere along the line, a government, it doesn't have to be the current finance minister, it can be another finance minister, can decide by legislation tabled in the parliament that we will use some of the proceeds from National Economic Fund or any aspect of the CIP, whether it is 5% annually, that we will use it to seed and to feed the sovereign wealth fund. That is a sovereign decision of a sovereign parliament, of a sovereign country, to decide that, okay, CIP will contribute to the National Economic Fund. But we have to realize that the thinking behind the sovereign wealth fund is not just to act as a bank or a credit union where you park the money and you keep it there and you wait for the goodwill of a financial institution, whether it is to add interest. It is supposed to be an investment instrument. It is supposed to be a national version of a venture capital fund where we find ways to invest. For example, if the government of Guyana, by the way, Guyana set up a sovereign wealth fund, you know. A sovereign wealth fund by any other name is still a sovereign wealth fund. They called it by a different name, but they set it up in 2019 for the purpose of managing the windfall earnings from the discovery of oil in the country. You know, I wish I could get the name of it, but Guyana set up a sovereign wealth fund in 2019. Prior to that, I think the only country in the Caribbean, our Caribbean, that had a sovereign wealth fund was Trinidad and Tobago. Now this is interesting. Trinidad and Tobago was considered to be the oil producing powerhouse, the petroleum powerhouse of the Caribbean. Along comes Guyana, and I think Senator Fede made a good point when he's saying that, look, practically all the countries that have sovereign wealth funds, that they are endowed with a huge and significant pool of resources that make them net exporters. They have huge gross domestic products built upon these resources that they have. St. Lucia doesn't exactly fit that category. That is true, and that is good, but here's the point. In this world that we live, when you are a tiny tot, when you are a sardine swimming in an ocean of sharks, there is only one way to survive. You have to be prepared to punch above your weight. You have to be prepared to be ambitious. You have to be prepared to be bold. You have to be prepared to be daring. You have to be prepared to leverage things that are not so obvious, that people do not see, such as we often hear about Singapore. And I think they are one of those countries, I think so, I've heard Malaysia, if I'm wrong, forgive me on that one, that have sovereign wealth fund. And look at what they have done. They don't have oil, they don't have those kinds of resources, but they invested and they reaped the benefits of their human capital, their human resource. And from the time I was growing up, very young at school, in social studies class and all, when the matter of natural resources was discussed, one of the things the teachers would always tell us, that the most important and most valuable natural resource of a country is its people. And the fact that this government here in St. Lucia, which does not have oil, which does not have what has become the latest craze of people wanting to annex other people's countries, you know, Madam President, rare earth metals, rare earths, you know, that's what we hear. Maybe we have a lot and we don't know, you know. But, you know, the fact that we don't have oil, the fact that we don't have rare earths, and if we have, maybe we should keep it quiet, don't talk about it, because we might end up finding we occupied the next day or so on, or annexed and so on. The fact that we don't have it means that we now understand and accept the imperative of people development. And that is something that in this world has become lost upon so many. We must never let it be lost upon us. Development is about people. Development ought to be focused on people, and development ought to be driven by people. And I am absolutely sure, without asking him or interviewing, that the thinking of our Prime Minister, our forward-looking Prime Minister, and those who serve with him, is that they are confident that the investments that they have made and continue to make in our people will provide the necessary capital and returns that in the absence of oil, in the absence of cobalt, in the absence of rare earths, that things like the youth economy and so on will be able to feed and supply a sovereign wealth fund. I'm confident of that. And that we are on a path to development, a trajectory that while we may not in the next decade catch up with Singapore, but we are heading in the right direction. And along the way, who knows what else may come up? Who knows what we may find on the seabed? Let's forget about, Grindberg and so on, Who knows what we may get out of the GPH investments? Who knows what we may get out of being a health destination with what we're investing in healthcare, in our hospitals and so on? Who knows what we may get, our CIP properly managed, our tourism industry and so on, that they will provide the material to fund a sovereign wealth fund. I just want to say that, Madam President, my colleague, Senator Jean, mentioned that the United States, on the 3rd of February this year, a month and a half ago, President Donald Trump announced that the United States, he wants a sovereign wealth fund established for the United States by next year, 2026. There had been much resistance in the United States for years. Economists had spoken against it, about the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund. They said sovereign wealth funds can be good, they can be bad, they even criticize other countries. But now they want to go the direction, just like they want to go to a national CIP. They always had CIP-like programs, but they now want a gold card kind of CIP and so on, Maybe they realize the success of what we have. They want some of it for themselves, and we better be careful and prepared. But that is what I really want to get to. The United States has had sovereign funds for a long time, not at the federal level. It's a federated country. But individual states like Texas, New Mexico, I forget some of the names of the others, they have had states. Now you can't call them sovereign because they're not nations, they're part of a nation. But within the context of the individual states, there are several of them that have had funds for specific purposes. Some of them have had funds to power education. Some of them have had funds to power railway projects. Some have had funds to feed, different projects, mega things in their country, and a lot of them, they have had them for perpetuity. In other words, it's not something we have with a sunset clause that we're going to close it. Canada does not have a federal sovereign wealth fund. But you're going to hear that Alberta, you're going to hear that British Columbia, they have provincial funds that you can call sovereign funds within the context of this. The final thing that I want to say, Madam President, there seems to be too much of this hypothetical, theoretical, visionary, alarmist calls that it's not going to be good because, this is all in the hands of the minister and he can do whatever he wants and, how can they be accountable when the minister will be responsible? And I'm beginning to wonder, when was there a time in St. Lucia that it was not a line minister holding a particular portfolio who was responsible for the appointment of boards? Where? Whether it is national utilities regulatory, if the minister for infrastructure, whoever is the minister responsible for that at the national level, or statutory bodies and so on, it is the minister who has portfolio responsibility for that agency, statutory whatever, who has always had the final say in the establishment of boards. According to the legislation, sometimes it can say that you give this person to nominate, okay, the Christian Council will nominate one member, the trade unions will nominate another member. You can do that in the legislation. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with, and the call is made, and the determination is made by the line minister. That's the other thing which I see seems to be this kind of false alarmist posture. Here's what I find wrong with it. The question of if there is a bubble, and if money gets stolen, or money goes missing, or there is lack of financial fidelity, or whatever it is. The fact that you have legislation establishing a sovereign wealth fund does not insulate it, does not place it in a vacuum does not place a wall of indemnity and impermeability between that bill, which will shortly, I expect, become an act, become the law, and other laws that pertain to crimes or bobble or embezzlement or whatever it is. So if you have the Finance Administration Act, for example, which deals with the manner in which the conduct of a board, of the resources at its disposal, including the financial resources, it does not mean that things are limited and restricted to this act, that somebody can violate the act and you can't touch them because this particular act doesn't say they could go to jail. It does not prevent them from coming under the remit and to be answerable to and to have their feet held to the fire by the revised criminal code, whatever section applies, by the Finance Administration Act, and any other legislation within the laws of St. Lucia which can deal with that. So I just want to say, I consider all this alarmist posturing to be sham. I consider it to have no basis. I consider it to have no legitimacy, and it is something we can put aside. That said, Madam President, I thank you for your indulgence, and I want again to restate and reaffirm my unreserved support for the Sovereign Wealth Fund St. Lucia Bill. Thank you.
Honorable Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to also thank the members who have contributed to this bill. I want to provide a brief explanation in response to some of the pertinent issues raised, particularly by the two independent senators. But I also want to take some time to share a few thoughts on some of the parts of presentation, particularly I'll start off with the young Senator Harrow. As a former teacher, principal, I'm always very sensitive and attentive to the thoughts and ideas and propositions of young people. And so I will seek to give him first priority in terms of my response. So, Madam President, first of all, the bill before us is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia. And in my presentation, I did indicate that there were about 176 countries around the world who have seen a need to establish such a fund. And I noted that Senator Harrow, in his brief presentation, stuck to his script. Very disciplined of him to have done that. But in sticking to his script, there were a couple of things that I just want to clarify. And I will forgive him because I believe it may be that he was not aware. I think Senator Daniel has just addressed one of them, and that is the issue with the appointment of board members by the minister. He raised the issue about ministers appointing board members. So I want to, through you, Madam President, remind or inform the young senator that it is the practice, the norm, and the convention that ministers are the ones who have the final say regarding appointments. Now, in some boards, there are certain statutes that require certain people to be part of the board, but ministers do. And I was saddened that his colleague, Senator Fede, who is a former minister, who has participated in this, who has been responsible for appointing boards, did not guide the young senator. But I thought it was important that I do so, and I hope Senator Harrow takes my advice for what it is. Madam President, I also noted that Senator Harrow made reference to the investment of the fund and seemed to have had some issues with the idea of the fund being invested and suspicious of what might happen because of that investment. I just want to assure Senator Harrow that this fund we are establishing is really, and I hope he would listen because that is in response to him, and not be distracted by his colleagues who, at this time. But I want to tell him, Madam President, that what we are doing today, I think he said he was 23 years old or 25, is to protect his future as a young person. this sovereign wealth fund is what is being put in place to secure his future. Should there be any unsuspecting or sudden natural disaster, hurricane, or any force of nature interrupting our regular proceedings. So I think he would have a very important stake in this sovereign wealth fund that is being established. We care about him and the young people of this country, and we are doing this in the interest of people like Senator Harrow and the young people who are listening. Madam President, the leader of opposition business, Senator Fede, very predictable in his approach earlier today, attempted to have his own debates on the sovereign wealth fund. I had to correct him when he started by reminding him that it was not the National Economic Fund that was the subject of the debate, and that it was the sovereign wealth fund. I had to do that because he was actually stating in his presentation that he was making reference in his presentation to the National Economic Fund. And of course, he noticed and then he acknowledged and then started using the correct term. You see, Madam President, when people come to this chamber with their pre-planned assault on what the government is doing, sometimes they don't even pay attention to what is before them. What is before them, or what is before us today, is a sovereign wealth fund. And we heard two arguments essentially. One about the National Economic Fund, and the other one about CIP. That was what was going on, and I knew it was coming. And that is why this morning I made sure I paid attention to the latest release by the U.S. Department of State Department, because I knew this thing was going to come about CIP, and I was ready. But Senator Fede, I am certain, Madam President, that he would have known, but attempted to bring back something that had already been explained, refuted, and corrected. You insisted. So, Madam President, I want to see.
Senator Fede.
Yeah, Madam President, I rise on a point of order.
What is your point of order?
The member is misleading the House. To suggest that I came here deliberately to mislead the House and I would have known that the State Department, he claims, and we await the documents, is really, really misleading and cast an improper motive upon my own character. You're suggesting that I have told an untruth. He is suggesting I've told an untruth.
Senator Ferdinand, I think you should respond.
Madam President, I will willfully, I will rephrase. I do not want to appear to be attacking anybody. Senator Fede is always purporting to have the information. He should have known. Maybe that's what I should have said. He should have known, if he was paying attention, coming today to debate something like this and having information about visa restrictions and so on. If there is information that is contrary to what you had on the very morning of the debate and you had done your research, you ought to have known that that information had been refuted. And by the way, Madam President, I have already made the information available, and you will be provided with it to ensure that what he said earlier today has been refuted. Madam President, I listened to the issue of the argument provided about the personalities or the persons who are going to be part of this sovereign wealth fund and the board and so on. And I heard Senator Fede make reference to civil servants as experts. Experts. I was delighted. It was refreshing to hear a member of this opposition referring to our civil servants as experts. Because I thought the experts were the people who were contracted to do the budget, and our civil servants weren't good enough to do so. So what were they, Ernst & Young, whoever they were? So it is refreshing today. You know, sometimes over time things are made right. He's righting a wrong today. Right the wrong, right the wrong. He just did that, and I am very pleased. I would like to commend the opposition and Senator Fede for stating to us in this chamber that our public servants are the experts and not them. Madam President, Senator Fede made extensive reference to the IMF March report. And I stood on a point of order a couple times because there were certain things that I thought that were not correct. And he tried to suggest that the report was casting negative issues or negative indicators about the economy. I'm not sure which March IMF report he was referring to, because as far as I know, that IMF report has projected, and I think Senator Jean has mentioned it, a 3.5% economic growth that follows 3 years of consecutive growth in this country. So, Madam President, when I heard Senator Fede come up with the IMF report, I was very happy because it gave me something to use as a reference point. So apparently he forgot to mention that, or he opted not to, but I want to make sure that it is known. Madam President, I don't know whether he has also forgotten that we are currently enjoying the lowest, and I say again, the lowest unemployment figures in the history of this country. And youth unemployment included, 8.8%. I don't know what it is that, and that was based on Senator Jean's source was quoted.
Madam President, I rise in the point of order.
What is your point of order, Senator?
Members are misleading the House.
Senator Gibeon?
The economic and social review presented by them have told us that 2022 cannot be compared to any other year. It is a new base year set for measuring unemployment in the country. You cannot say in the history of the country. That is wrong.
Please proceed, Senator Fede.
Madam President, I remember the first time I heard about rebasing in this country while I was an opposition senator when his government was in office. And we understand clearly what that means. I do not need a lecture from Senator Fede about rebasing. And I will state exactly what the statistics department says. It says, whether he wants to look at rebasing or whatever he wants to use as the mechanism, the fact remains that St. Lucia enjoys an 8.8% unemployment rate. Madam President, il passe à pécher moi dit ça c'est la vérité. La vérité qu'il a. And I am quoting from a legitimate source in this country. If he has no confidence, he just said the civil servants are the experts. The civil servants are the experts. Madam President, liquidi. Même ces civil servants là, qu'a dit nous ni on numéro 8.8% monde qui pas qu'à travailler dans cette liste. Même ces civil servants là, après ça yo pas expert, c'est où qui expert? Pardon, Madam President. C'est lui qui expert. The experts that he referred to are the public servants when conveniently he wanted to make a point. Are not they are the same people who are telling us today that our unemployment figures have come down from 26% or wherever it was to 8.8%, single digits.
That's right.
But Madam President, moi savent, les moi dit ça, ça ka
Strikes a nerve.
ça ka piché. Madam President, I do not think it is right for us to conveniently praise our public servants when we want to criticize the existing government and ignore their work, their figures, their statistics when we want to discredit it. It's hypocrisy, Madam President. So, Madam President, IMF report was what he quoted, and it's indicating that we have reduced inflation. It is also indicating that there is solid liquidity in this country. And that is why we had a surplus, a primary surplus. And that is why the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance was able to get $34.5 million to give a back pay to public servants. And that is why the Minister of Finance and Prime Minister was also able to get $44.5 million to give public servants a salary increase. And if you add the two, that is $79 million that is being put in the hands of the people of this country. Madame President, moi savle moi dit ça, ça ka pitcher à dans monde. Mais moi kay dit parce que c'est la vérité. Madame President, moi kay dit à Créole. Sénateur Fédé a dit que IMF report ka mouchwe qui cette ici l'économie nous l'année problème et puis. Mais même report IMF ça ka mouchwe qui cette ici a fait tellement bien nous amène les affaires inflation, les affaires les prix bagaille ka monter, nous amène descendre. Solid liquidity, ça veut dire l'année chay l'argent qui a circulé, qui a passé en pays, l'argent qui a allé venir en pays. Ça veut dire aussi, parce que l'argent qui a allé venir et puis nous avons managé le pays bien, le gouvernement a payé 34,5 millions de dollars pour bailler servante civile en back pay. Ça veut dire un bonus en les salaires. Ça veut dire aussi, le gouvernement a joint 44,5 millions de dollars pour ça mener salaire servante civile monter à pays ça. So comment vous voulez nous croire? L'économie a pays a fait tellement mauvais, bagaille mauvais tellement. Et puis le gouvernement ça mettait autant l'argent la même dans cette liste. Madam President, that argument will not be allowed to get away. So Madam President, Senator Ferry attempted to give us a lecture on fiscal management. Madam President, if I want to listen to a lecture on fiscal management, you know who I'll listen to? You know who is competent enough to be able to tell me a little bit about fiscal management and understands finance? The parliamentary representative for Ansari County. The reason why Senator Fede is sitting there today, that's the gentleman I will go to if I need any finance and fiscal management information or advice. Because he is partly responsible for what we are enjoying today in the office of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance. My besoin PS advice from Senator Fede, Madame President, là vini pour faire ménager l'argent pays. Si moi voulais pièce mon JD moi ça moi kay demander mon là qui a représenté en Slawe Kanawi moi kay demander mon ça là pas Senator Fede. Madam President, Senator Fede took issue with the primary surplus balance, as I thought was mentioned by a previous senator, trying to trivialize it. Primary surplus, primary balance. Madam President, I understand why. He's not accustomed to saying that in the parliament. He's accustomed to talking about deficits. That is what his government oversaw. Il pas habitué parler de surplus côté le gouvernement après payer toute dette li, après payer servante civile, il n'y a ton petit bagay pour mettre à ce côté. Les ité gouvernement, celle ça a été ça, c'est déficit. Ça veut dire les ou ka fait moins l'argent passé au cadoué. You have less. Your fiscal situation realizes a deficit. He's accustomed, so I will excuse him, Madam President. Now, Senator Jean spoke of fiscal discipline, and I think there's one thing she forgot to mention when she was giving examples of fiscal indiscipline by the previous administration. Just one thing, and it is a reality we are living with today. Madam President, because of the fiscal indiscipline and the wastage that we endured between 2021 and 2016 and 2021, we have had, as she correctly said, to relocate the dump and to truck garbage from the Viewfort facility to Deglo. Do you know, Madam President, and I live in the South, every morning, depending on what time I leave my home, I have to be driving behind a garbage truck that has to haul waste from Vieux-Fort to Dayglow. I have to deal with the stench, I have to deal with the traffic, and not only me. And you know what is also instructive, Madam President? Today, the government, through the Solid Waste Department, is spending $70,000 a month. Wow. It's costing this government $70,000 every single month to keep that thing going. We will find an alternative. But that is what has happened because of fiscal mismanagement. We did not have to be doing that if they had not interfered with what was going on in the South. Favini parle about fiscal management. Fait que nous avons payé truck pusher et 10 sorties vieux fort aller de glo $70,000 tous les mois. Madam President, I think I've said enough on the matter of Senator Fede. I cannot give any good news when I rebut on his presentation. So I will move to some more positive and constructive discussion that we heard from the two independent senators. First of all, Senator Charles spoke of the type of investment, and we need to watch the type of investment that comes in setting up that fund. It may be in conflict with our climate change principles. Very correct, Madam President, very correct. And he gave an example that if an investor comes with something like something to do with fuel or fossil fuel that will harm the environment, what will we do? I want to assure Senator Charles that this government is responsible and always finds balance in its policies. And we would not run into an investment just because somebody says we can make money. And we have taken our investment business very seriously. We have to ensure that the Development Control Authority is on board, and we would be more willing to encourage an investor who will probably want to be to use alternative energy to be able to do something about using the geothermal energy in Soufrière than to run into anything that will harm our environment. So I give him the assurance that we will not be irresponsible like some of our predecessors and engage in that. He also mentioned something very important that I thought was needed a response. He said something about the saving not only from our surplus, but from our revenue. Madam President, I will say to Senator Charles, there's a simple principle I learned as a young teacher when I started working, and my mom used to remind me. Before you save money, it's good to save, but before you save, pay your debts. You have to pay your bills. And so, before we can take money out of our revenue to do anything, to put on the side, we have to pay our bills. And so that dilemma will always exist, but I think that was a very reasonable suggestion. But I will assure him that, and some of the bills we have to pay, if I may, through you, Madam President, Senator Charles, we did not incur, but we have to pay them because we're the government of the day. Madam President, finally, Senator Lee made some observations, and he did mention the potential of the fund. I think he explained that he understood it, but he mentioned some issues with regard to operation. And as it was with the tourism development bill and other legislation that we have come to this House, it is true that legislation should come with regulations. That is true. But in some cases, the regulations follow thereafter. And in many cases, the regulations may have to be reviewed and changed to reflect the situation at the time. And so I think it is important that while we have come to Parliament to pass the legislation, that the regulations should follow. And because it's climate change involved, there's so much that happens and so much flexibility that you need to have, that monies that are set aside for climate change climate change covers a cross-section of issues. Social issues, infrastructure issues, environmental issues. So it gives you quite a bit of space in which you can expend monies that you have saved or you've set aside for climate change because of all the various implications of climate change. But I thought these were very critical issues. And he did mention something also about the accountability, what happens with that. I wanted to draw his attention to sections 42 and 43 of the bill, where it makes provisions for a forensic audit to be done. And I think that is a deliberate insertion for the government to ensure that there is some level of scrutiny and accountability as far as how the accounts of this fund is utilized. So, Madam President, I again want to reassure St. Lucians that this sovereign wealth fund has a proper intention, and the intention is that we know the vulnerability of our country, and we believe that it's important now that the economy is doing well. Now that I'm speaking about 3% growth for 3 consecutive years, there was a time in this country when bananas was king, the days of green gold, and we did not do what we're doing today. The farmers of this country, a lot of them are suffering today because there is nothing in place for their social protection. There is nothing in place. They don't have a pension. There is nothing to protect them. When the European Union stopped giving us preferential treatment and bananas is not what it was before, our farmers, a lot of them suffered and are still suffering. While things are good, while the sun is shining on this government and on the people of this country, because of the prudent management of this government, while we can boast of growth in the economy, we can boast of surplus, the economy is doing well, we need to make sure that at this time we set up a fund like this one to ensure that we set something aside, as was said by everybody in here, for rainy days, including Senator Fede, who mentioned wet days. We put this fund aside so that should things change, should things get rough, that we as a country have something to fall back on. And so with all of that, Madam President, I want to reiterate my full support for this bill and look forward to its benefits to the people of our country. Thank you.
Senators, the question is that the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia bill be read a second time. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to provide for the establishment of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia and for related matters.
Clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Part 1, clauses 3 to 4.
Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia.
Part 1, clauses 3 to 4 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Part 2, clauses 5 to 43.
Management of the fund.
Part 2, clauses 5 to 43 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Part 3, clauses 44 to 50.
Financing of the fund.
Part 3, clauses 44 to 50 stands part of the bill.
Madam President, I'm not sure if there was an amendment in the lower house to section 33. Under custodian, I think there are some words there that are not correct. If we go to section 33, well, I just want to point out here, it reads, the board shall, on the advice of the minister and cabinet, appoint by instrument in writing, on terms and conditions, the board, on the advice of the minister and cabinet, determines a custodian for the fund. I think there was there appears to be some error in the words. I think the error is that they repeated on the advice of the minister. The board shall, on the advice of the minister and cabinet, appoint by instrument in writing, on terms and conditions, the board, No, I think it has to say in writing on terms and conditions, determine a custodian for the fund. I think it's repeated. I think on the advice of it's repeated.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President,
terms and
I
conditions of
think it can be read differently because of the way it's phrased. After board, on the advice of the minister and cabinet determines. No, I think it's just a matter of the semantics. Yeah, I think it's he's correct, terms and conditions of the appointment and not the board. So I think as is, I think it can be allowed to.
I take advice from you. Okay. So we proceed. So part 3, clauses 44 to 50 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Part 4, clauses 51 to 53.
Miscellaneous.
Part 4, clauses 51 to 53 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Clause 1.
Short title and commencement.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Senators, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
As many as are of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Senators, I beg to report that the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia bill went through committee stage without amendments. Honorable Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that the reports of the committee be adopted and that the bill be read a third time and passed.
Senators, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and that the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia bill be read a third time and passed. I now put the question. As many as of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the King's Most Excellent Majesty by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and Senate of St. Lucia, and by the authority of the same as follows. This Act may be cited as the Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia, Act 2025. This Act shall come into force on a date due to be fixed by the Minister by order published in the Gazette.
Honorable Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I move that the Senate stands suspended until 3 p.m. 3 p.m. 3 in the afternoon.
Okay. Senators, the question is that the sitting of Senate be suspended until 3 p.m. I now put the question. As many as of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Sitting suspended until 3 p.m.
Session Sénat là deux bouts à présent pour un petit moment enfin pour déjeuner à midi il y a veillé à 3h après-midi mais avant ça on va tenir en discussion changer dernière fois nous parler tout on a tenu un petit problème avec ça qui dit la prochaine 10 minutes ça c'est même regarde même Barama ça c'est le sénateur d'élu, ça c'est un sénateur indépendant, il était capable d'aller à cette situation. Avec ça qui est intéressant aujourd'hui, c'est des indépendants, sénateurs indépendants parlaient avant, avec il était parler du conseil, tous les deux d'une manière, ils ont supporté ça c'est pas motion, c'est bill. Le fonds SWF là, ça c'est pour mettre l'argent à ce côté, à sous réserve pour assister le pays, pour développer le pays. Mais comment tu as dit, tous les deux, nous avons parlé des indépendants qui n'ont de petits concernent à cette chose. Premièrement, sénateur Amber Charles, tu as dit comme que il y a des petits concernent qui, pour on le fait comme ça, mériter un monde qui étudie les affaires changement climat pour assurer un management c'est board là qui a managé les affaires ça là. Et moi que ça c'est un concern. Il y a aussi qui parlait à ça en chat un exemple différentes places avec l'argent qui peut être dépensé pour ça. Aussi c'est un sénateur Deli aussi mentionné concerné, mais généralement il dit comme que à son management concerné c'est plutôt à son management dans ça le fond pour faire assez il particulièrement parler à ce ça nous a créé anglais transparency pour faire un bagage clair pour la parenthèse toute à ce manière il a managé il parlait sérieusement à ça peut-être Virgile peut-être qu'il ça dit à ce laisser contribution c'est les autres
yes oui Michael and yes the some of the concerns that came up in terms of the bill, as you said, it was overwhelmingly supported, but some of the concerns, particularly from the two independent senators, as you said, I just want to highlight independent Senator Lee's concern when he spoke about transparency, the need for transparency, and that he felt there wasn't anything in the, or at least it wasn't they weren't given the regulations, in that if they had it, he could have seen, what exactly the penalties for if somebody had contravened any rule or regulation. So his concern basically was in that he felt there wasn't enough allocation
for reporting. He said yes.
For reporting, yes. Okay. There wasn't, anything stipulated for, if anyone had contravened regulations. But the government senator, in fact, disagreed. The government senator Alison Shaw, because she was saying that in fact the bill was quite unique in that some of the regulations that were stipulated was that there would be stringent conditions for disqualification of a board member. It was stipulated that there would also be, the bill also made provisions for auditing, and as well as for special forensic financial auditing. So she said, in fact, the bill was quite unique in that it did make allowances, for some of those concerns that were brought up. All in all, the opposition senator, leader of opposition business, Senator Dominic Fede, of course, he outright opposed the bill using the same argument that his leader had used when the bill was discussed in the lower house, and that there is already an economic fund. And he was saying, it couldn't be. But he used the time to not necessarily speak to the bill, but he spoke about CIP, he spoke about so many other issues. Everything was just conflated in his contribution. And I just want to briefly mention his colleague, young Senator Harrow. He felt, there was some, in the nutshell of his contribution, he was saying there are so many other important things, that the government should look into at this time, other than the sovereign wealth fund, and he spoke about youth development, he spoke about education. But all in all, this was the contribution. This was what transpired this morning in the House, and of course, the bill went through the stages and it was passed.
D'accord. Eh bien, merci un peu, Virgile. Nous avons été virés ici à 3 heures. Le Sénat là a viré continuer puisqu'il a dit les autres bills. Nous avons discuté un code criminel là, changé. Les semaines passées, ça c'est même parlement, ça c'est un gars qui a discuté un changement côté juge, comme juge seulement, ça conduit l'audience. Avec sans jury, il a regardé pour discuter loi ça là, et aussi en l'autre qui a supporté, ça il va appeler Supreme Court. So, nous avons discuté ça à 3 heures de nous dévirer. Alors nous avons invité pour virer, je ne sais pas nous, mais nous avons déviré à 3 heures.